Good evening and welcome to the Truth Tank. I am your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening to the Truth Tank, welcome, and if you're coming back for more, welcome back. This is the first ever Truth Tank Christmas special. A big Merry Christmas to everybody out there listening. For this episode I wanted to cover something slightly Christmassy to fit with the festive season, but also something historical. So we're going to be having a look at one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented historical characters in the biblical story, and that is none other than King Herod the Great. You might remember King Herod from such stories as the Massacre of Innocents, but is this a historically accurate portrayal of King Herod? King Herod is often portrayed as the biblical bad guy, but is he simply just a convenient villain? We'll be looking at one of history's most misunderstood and fascinating characters. He appears in the first Christmas story, i.e. the birth of Jesus, but what is true and what is not? And why has Herod the Great's reputation been so tarnished? These are the questions we'll be looking at on this episode and over the course of 2 podcasts. Hopefully it won't run into 3, but don't hold it against me if it ends up being 3 parts. This is a very interesting and complex time period. Some of the who's who of historical figures all overlap. You have Cleopatra, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Octavian, Herod, a young Jesus, and many others all make an appearance in this very fascinating, dramatic, action-packed and violent time. So, is there any truth to these claims, and what facts has the Bible got wrong? There are a lot of big discrepancies in his actions in the Bible and what took place in reality. Who was the historical Herod, and what did he do? What liberties did the Bible take? I'm not trying to offend anyone's religious sensibilities, I'm just trying to relay the facts and get to the truth of who the real Herod the Great was. I can see why he was picked as a biblical bad guy. Some of the stuff he did in reality was pretty bad. He's an easy candidate for a bad guy. I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm not trying to disprove or prove anything, I'm just trying to give you some facts on Herod the Great. So as always, let's get our red pills ready, let's dig deep and let's go down that rabbit hole. This is episode 21, King Herod the Great, Biblical Bad Guy or Convenient Villain, Part 1. Before we look at Herod's life and how he ruled a vast, fractured and unstable region, at a time of transition and turmoil in Jerusalem and its surrounding lands of Judah, we need to look at his role in the Bible, more specifically the biblical account of the Massacre of Innocents in the book of Matthew. So, to set the stage for our tale, we need to take a trip back in time to ancient Judah, to the year 6 BC, or 4 BC, depending on who you ask. It is a time of turmoil and change. Judah had been fought over for decades, and everybody wanted a piece of the Judah pie. The Parthians wanted a bit, the Romans wanted a bit, the Egyptians wanted a bit, the who's who's of historical cultures all wanted a slice of that pie. The Romans invaded Jerusalem in 63 BC and had a pretty big foothold by the time Herod the Great was born. They brought a whole lot of problems to the area and subjugated the people and its many religions to Roman rule. Although the Romans probably weren't as bad as they were made out to be, they did let Jewish leaders and religions rule and lead in a manner they saw fit, but there was strings attached. You had to pay a tribute and taxes back to Rome. You were free to rule in some aspects, but you weren't completely free. You always had someone looking over your shoulder. So at this time, Herod divides public opinion, and while he enjoys a very lavish lifestyle, he has Rome's best interests at heart, or so we've been told. There is a lot of bad shit that Herod has been accused of. Herod is frequently called a Roman puppet by many historians. He's also referred to as being insane. Most of us will know the story of the Massacre of Innocents and Herod's pathological obsession with finding the newborn Jesus that was prophesied to bring an end to his rule. In the historical accounts, Herod is referred to by 2 names, Herod the Great or Herod the Builder, and sometimes he is referred to as Herod the Mad. So how much is true and how much is false, and what is the stuff of good storytelling and legend? That's the thing with history, it's never 100% factual. At most times it's about 60 to probably 80% accurate, maybe more around the 70%. There's a whole lot of questions. Every time you find an answer, it brings up 10 more questions. And a lot of historians and archaeologists make these huge claims that this is how this was done, this is what happened, this is set in stone and there's no other alternative. And that's one of the huge problems I have with that field. You'll never find the correct answer if you're constantly trying to promote and facilitate your own ideas and theories, or perpetuate outdated theories from 100 to 150 years ago where these people knew nothing about these cultures and filled in the blanks with their own prejudices. Let's have a look at the character of Herod in the Bible, in the biblical story of Jesus' birth. Herod appears in the New Testament in the book of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 1, and the Gospel of Luke. So I had to dust off the old King James Bible for this. This is Matthew 2.1. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at his rising, and we have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judah, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men, and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary with his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. As we know, stars don't move in the sky. So was the Star of Bethlehem a UFO? The escape to Egypt. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So this brings us to the Massacre of Infants, also known as the Massacre of Innocents. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing a loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled, because they are no more. The return to Egypt. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judah in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He would be called a Nazarene. And that's about all Matthew mentions of Herod the Great. The book of Matthew presents an interesting argument. It's a very good story, but there's not a huge amount of references to Herod other than him being a bad guy. So let's have a look at Matthew in more detail. There's not a lot of detail given about Herod or Jesus or really anybody in the story. We know he's a king who's ruling, and he seems to be a pretty harsh guy. So the precise date of Jesus' birth isn't given. This does make things harder when trying to date the events in question. It's assumed it's between the years 6 and 4 BC. So this brings up a huge problem in history. I did read somewhere a long time ago, these historians were saying that all of human history may be out by anywhere from 5 to 250 years, including the biblical narrative. They think that Jesus may be either 250 years before or after the timeline he's mentioned in, i.e. 6 to 4 BC. They think that that time might have already happened, so it's probably more like 200 BC, might be more accurate for the birth of Jesus, or the opposite way. It brings up a whole set of questions, and it's an absolute headfuck to try and figure out the timeline of human history. With all the technology we have available to us at the moment, it still makes trying to pinpoint an accurate timeline very difficult. So, why is this important, and how does this relate to Herod? Well, according to Wikipedia, I know it's not a great source, but it's a good place to start. There are a few main methods to determine/estimate the year of Jesus' birth. The first is based on the Gospels, which make mention of Herod's reign. The second is by subtracting Jesus' agreed upon age of around 30 years old. This being the same time he started preaching, according to Luke 3.23. It was also the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius' rule, which gives us another pinpoint and another time to try and cross-reference these dates. Both methods coincide with Herod's rule and puts the date of birth for Jesus around 2 BC, before Herod's death around 4 BC. So Jesus was roughly 2 years old at the time of Herod's death. So this makes things difficult. We will probably never know for sure the exact date of Herod's death or Jesus' birth, but it is a good place to start. So consulting Wikipedia again, I couldn't find a lot of other information about biblical timeline accuracy. Wikipedia had a really short, easy to understand summary of how this works and how it might affect the overall timeline. So this is from Wikipedia. Biblical references to King Herod's reign. The two nativity accounts of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke differ substantially from each other and are considered to have been written independently. However, some consistent elements are evidently derived from a common early tradition. Jesus was born under the Judean king Herod the Great, Matthew 2.1, Luke 1.5, versus Luke 2.1. In Bethlehem, once again, Matthew and Luke both agree on this. Prior to his parents moving to Nazareth, Matthew highlights his parents moved, but in the book of Luke 2.39, they returned to Nazareth, or before they returned to Nazareth. Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, were betrothed, Matthew 1:18-20, Luke 1:27-5. His birth was a virgin birth conceived by the Holy Spirit. Angels announced Jesus' birth, his name, his role as the Messiah, being a descendant of King David and the Son of God, and his mission to save his people from sin, Matthew 1:21, Luke 1:77-11:30. Thus, both Luke and Matthew independently associate Jesus' birth with the reign of Herod the Great. Matthew furthermore implies that Jesus was up to 2 years old when Herod reportedly ordered the Massacre of the Innocents, that is, the murder of all boys in Bethlehem up to the age of 2, Matthew 2:16. Both scholarship concerning the date of Herod's death follows Emil Schucher's calculations published in 1896. And unfortunately, I don't think anyone has ever done any further research on that date. They've kind of just accepted or gone with the over 100-year account. But, what do I know? That could be correct. Which provides a traditional date of 1 BC to 4 BC. Two of Herod's sons, Archelaus and Philip the Tetrarch, dated their rule from 4 BC, though Archelaus apparently held royal authority during Herod's lifetime. Philip's reign would last for 37 years until his death in the traditionally accepted 20th year of Tiberius, AD 34. which implies his ascension as 4 BC. The oldest manuscripts of Josephus' Antiquities has the death of Philip in the 22nd year, not the 20th, of Tiberius. In the British Library there is not a single manuscript prior to AD 1544 that has the traditionally accepted 20th year of Tiberius for the death of Philip. This evidence removes the main obstacle for a later date of 1 BC for the death of Herod. A list of the oldest manuscripts is found on page 91. Josephus re-examined, Dr. Beyer. Some scholars support the traditional date of 1 BC for Herod's death. Filmer and Steinman, for example, propose that Herod died in 1 BC and that his heirs backdated their reigns to 4 to 3 BC to assert an overlapping with Herod's rule and bolster their own legitimacy. In Josephus' account, Herod's death was preceded by a lunar eclipse and followed by Passover. An eclipse took place in 4 BC on 13th of March, about 29 days before Passover, and this eclipse has been suggested as the one referred to by Josephus. There were, however, other eclipses during this period, and there are proponents of 5 BC, and the 2 eclipses of 1 BC occurring 10th of January and December 29th. Nevertheless, most scholars favour a birth year for Jesus between 6 and 4 BC. Very interesting. That does shed some new light on the old timeline argument. Lunar eclipses and celestial movements are also a pretty good way to accurately pinpoint a date and time. Referring back to the Mayans again, this is pretty much how they worked out the Mayan calendar, was by the celestial movements. It takes a certain amount of years for the Earth to rotate around the universe, which is something that's never going to change. That also provides a reliable source of accurate time. They mention a man named Josephus. I'll be referring back to him quite a bit throughout this podcast and the next one. Josephus was a 1st century Roman Jewish historian. He wrote the accounts on Herod and basically the whole Jewish civil war and the whole area of Judah about 100 years after Herod's death. He was born Titus Flavius Josephus. So he's part Roman, part Jewish, so he had a very vested interest on the affairs and history of the Jewish world and the Roman world. A lot of our historical accounts do come from Josephus' works. He wrote a few books, one being The Jewish War and the other Antiquities of the Jews. I'll be referring to the Jewish War. It chronicles what was happening at this moment in a lot of detail, and it's one of the few reliable historical sources of the time, and probably one of the only ones. He's a pretty interesting character, and it's thanks to him that we have so much information. So, let's break down and have a detailed look at what made Herod Herod. We're going to look at his entire life, starting with what we know about him from the historical records, going right through up until his death and his legacy. The first episode of the podcast will be covering his early life, going right up until the start of his reign. In part 2, we're going to be looking at his life as a ruler and his eventual decline into madness. This will give us a better picture of the real Herod. It also might help shed some light on why he was chosen as the bad guy in the Jesus story, and how the facts have influenced the narrative. The early years. This will take us up until the retaking of Jerusalem. The story of Herod is a long and complex one. He was born into privilege and wealth, and had a pretty good upbringing, considering the standard of living 2,000 years ago. But things were not always easy for Herod. From an early age, he had a paranoid outlook on life, which continues and worsens throughout his life. Herod is a very complex fellow, to say the least. He isn't the worst person in history, but he isn't a saint either. The best way to describe King Herod to a modern audience would be to say he was like a character from a David Fincher film meets Patrick Bateman. He has a bit of a chip on his shoulder that grows over the years. Herod is a man that really does care what others think of him and his standing in society, which in turn fuels his insecurities and his paranoia. And this is where a lot of the accounts of Herod the Mad come from. In his defense, some of his paranoia is warranted, some of it is misplaced, but we will come to that a little later. Herod also has a vain streak, which is not really a good thing, not really a bad thing. The positive aspect of his vanity is it prompts his ambition and innovation. On the negative side of things, it also fuels his anxiety and some very poor decision making. So what causes this, or what might have contributed to some of his traits? Bearing in mind not everything about Herod is bad or has a negative effect. I would argue that he was probably by far the best choice of leader for Judah at this given point in history. Herod, for all his faults, was a man who possessed great vision, ambition, and who I think really did care a lot about his people. He wasn't just a ruler for ruler's sake. He generally does seem to care about the welfare of the various different religious groups and people that he is ruling. His legacy might be shrouded in mystery, but what he built in a time of turmoil and transition, and what he left behind will remain forever. Herod was born around the year 74 BC in Idumea, the southern region of Judah. Adding fuel to his mental state and to a degree his ambition was Herod's mixed heritage and cross-religious and cultural ancestry. Herod's father was Antipater the Idumean, who served as a high-ranking official under the Entrarch Hyrcanus II. He was the second of three sons of Antipater. Herod's father is an Idumean and his mother, Cypros, is a Nabatean Arab. This is where his ethnic background gets interesting. It will also follow him around for the rest of his life. It would also become a constant obstacle for him in his legitimacy for the Judean throne. His father is an Idumean and his mother a Nabatean Arab. Just like his heritage, there was a reoccurring theme of duality that surrounds Herod's life. Herod is definitely on both ends of the extreme scale on his personal life and his professional life. But before we get too much into Herod, it's very important to note his father Antipater. Without getting a clear backstory on Antipater, it makes Herod's story very hard to understand. So before we go too far into Herod, let's have a look at his father. Antipater is a central and very important figure in this tale, and it's worth mentioning him and what he helped build during his lifetime. Both of their stories are intertwined with one another. If it weren't for him, Herod would most likely not have achieved the level of status that he did. It's really due to his father's relationships and the kingdom he helped build that paves the way for Herod and his brothers to rule later on. And in all likelihood, Herod's kingdom would have been a hell of a lot slower growing if it wasn't for his father's foundations. So Antipater was born around the year 113 to 114 BC. He was an Edomite by birth and a Jew by way of conversion. There is an interesting backstory here that brings up another key figure in this tale, John Hyrcanus I, not to be confused with the aptly named John Hyrcanus II. That's another recurring theme with this tale, is there's a lot of individuals with the same or similar sounding names, such as Hyrcanus, Antipater, Antipas, Herod I, Herod II, and Herod III. It gets very confusing trying to keep track of all these people and keep the timelines somewhat coherent. So John Hyrcanus worked for Simon the Great before he was murdered by his son-in-law in 134 BC. There's a lot of in-family murder committed by these people, which is also another reoccurring theme. So this all took place when Simon was invited to dinner. His wife and sons were taken hostage in the process. Assassins were sent to kill John, but John was a pretty crafty bugger. He fled and left Jerusalem before the assassins could find him. So John holds the city. He chased after his conspirators before his brother and mother were killed. This also leaves John as the sole heir to the throne. But no one expected John to become a high priest. As he was the third son, he wasn't even confident in his own abilities to do so. So he never intends or has any aspirations to become high priest. It's not a role he had trained for. He had two other brothers that were probably going to get it. So this also brought to a close the Maccabean dynasty. Simon was the last of the old generation of rulers. This paves the way for a new dynasty and a dramatic change in the power structure of the region. It's a pretty critical moment, and it sets up probably the next 100 or so years. So, John rises to power and he becomes the high priest. Josephus even comments on John Hyrcanus' leadership abilities, claiming that he has three of the desired traits to lead, one being the rule of nation, the house of a high priest, and the gift of prophecy. But as always, and this is the third recurring theme in this story, Things aren't easy, and there is always trouble on the horizon. Like I mentioned in the opening, there's a hell of a lot of action that takes place in this time period. This also happens at a time where Judah appears on the radar of many a powerful empire. So while the Jewish world was at war with itself, a sneaky, Seleucid king named Antiochus VII Sidonides, is a fucking mouthful, takes advantage of the situation and attacks the region, laying siege to Jerusalem in the process. Oh yeah, there's another reoccurring theme, is Jerusalem is attacked pretty much every second week in this time period. It's basically that it's a fortified city, everyone falls back there, and it's always besieged by somebody who wants to control absolute power in the region. This causes a famine in the city and prompts Antiochus to negotiate and broker a peace treaty with John, who agreed and also wanted a peaceful resolution. So he surrenders all of the Maccabean lands out of the city limits and promises to demolish the old walls of the city. John now had an alliance with the king. So John's alliance with another king is a position I really think he excels at. I think this is the kind of the place he wanted to be. I don't think he was ever comfortable with absolute rule. I think he was more of a behind-the-scenes, pulling the strings kind of guy. He liked to rule from the shadows. Someone else can take the heat and can be the public face, but he was kind of this behind-the-scenes power base that controlled whatever ruler that was in power. He seems a little sneaky. Is this his ultimate plan, is just to rule from the shadows? Or is he simply not comfortable in the limelight? So John was now obligated to serve the Greek king, which did put him in a bit of a sticky situation when Antiochus went to war with the Parthian Empire. John, being the sly dog that he is, may or may not have had a secret arrangement with the Parthian king. Yeah, okay, so you see John's work pulling strings, he's making deals behind people's backs. So he is quite sneaky and he's quite a cunning leader, even if he doesn't want to take absolute responsibility. He is definitely playing his own politics behind the scenes with everybody. So you can make the argument that he's the real ruler of Judah, not Antiochus at this time. So the campaign didn't turn out as intended for Antiochus. He was killed not long after. John had played this smart. His alleged dealings with the Parthians might have been a calculated move to secure his own kingdom and survival in the process, but also for the many Jewish subjects that lived under the Parthian rule. So this sheds a little more light onto Hyrcanassus. Is he a selfish ruler? Does he just want absolute power for himself? Or is he doing this for the benefit of the Jews that are subjugated under the Parthian rule? It seems like his priority is the welfare of these people and not ultimate glory for himself. So maybe John is a good guy after all. John gets out of this alive and he has his kingdom reinstated, without the attachment of another king. So he is now free to run things as he sees fit. So John embarks on a conquest of plunders. He plunders the tomb of David and takes the lands of Madaba across the river Jordan and into Edomite territory. This is where Antipater comes into it. The violation of David's tomb was a very controversial move that he made. This is a key figure in the Jewish religion and caused a lot of offense by him plundering the tomb. This is a big no-no, and it's something that may come back to bite Hyrcanassus in the future. So this may or may not have had far-reaching consequences for his religious violations of David's tomb. This may have set the standard for future leaders that followed him, i.e. Antipater and Herod. This obviously didn't go down very well with the public. Did they see every non 100% Jewish ruler, or any ruler for that fact, as someone that couldn't be trusted based on this violation? Was this just the new norm for political leadership? So John forces the conversion of the Edomite population. So the Edomites are now known as the Idumeans to Judaism. This is also why Antipater and Herod have Idumean heritage and Jewish beliefs. John conquers Samaria and Galilee, expanding his kingdom and adding provinces to the land of Judah. Does this pave the way for Herod's paranoia and the family's upheaval in Jewish eyes? So John brings with him a lot of destruction in expanding his lands. He doesn't do this peacefully or quietly. He destroys Samaria temples, and the general destruction he brings while expanding his lands pisses a lot of people off. So naturally, future generations don't trust him or any leadership that follows him. The same way we don't trust modern day politicians. we just naturally assume they're lying out of their ass and they're full of shit, which most cases they are. They're purely in it for themselves and they don't care who they hurt or what they have to bulldoze in order to get a new shopping mall built because someone's paid them off. And this is a very similar thing that Hyrcanassus is doing. That's enough about John. Let's go back to Antipater. So Antipater's predecessors converted to Judaism as far back as the 2nd century, but little could they know that this would become one of the biggest hindrances to future generation rulers, especially for Antipater and Herod. It was a double-edged sword for Antipater and later for Herod, as the Edomites didn't get along well with the Romans or any other of the Jewish groups in the region. An Idumean ruler that served Rome's interests was untrustworthy to the Jewish and Idumean populations. So these two find themselves in a bit of a pickle. They're trying to serve two masters, essentially. On the one hand, this worked in their favour when politics were involved. The Romans saw their mixed heritage as an opportunity, a way of bridging the racial and faith gaps in the populations. So in Roman eyes, they were basically seen as, hey look, this guy's Idumean and he's also Jewish, so they're the people that they wanted to rule, right? So what could go wrong? This guy's half and half, the people will love him. People are easier to rule if they think you are one of them. This is a tactic that's used by modern day politicians and it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. The thought behind this was if they were from here, believe this, were half that, and half this, they would appeal to the various groups and faiths in ancient Israel. In other words, the Romans had someone who could make things run smoother when they wanted to control or pass a law that would piss off any of the various groups. After all, a ruler with Jewish beliefs would be more inclined to pass a law or collect a tax from Jewish people who had their interest at heart, or so the thought process goes. I'm not really surprised that these two had their fair share of issues, and I'm definitely not surprised Herod was paranoid. When so many doubted his ability to rule, let alone his legitimacy to rule, and his right to rule, I do get why he was paranoid all the time. He's got all these eyes upon him, no one trusts him, no one thinks he has the right to rule. Any little fuck up is going to be heavily criticised. If he's too weak, he pisses people off, he makes people angry, people don't trust him. If he's too tough, people rise up and revolt against him. So he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. He has to find this balance point where he can rule fairly but justly, be tough but not too tough. He finds himself in a very, very difficult position. If he was born in Jerusalem and was 100% Jewish, things probably would have been different. People might have trusted him more. But because of his background and upbringing, he is seen as untrustworthy. So this part of history gets very confusing sometimes. There are so many key figures, things are happening, and all these different beliefs are all going on at the same time. The Idumeans identify their origins as being Nabatean. The Nabateans made up a large portion of the population of Western Judah and had a pretty good relationship and also had families with Judeans and took on a majority of their beliefs and customs that filtered down and grew over the generations. Herod and his parents are from these very same bloodlines and the mixing of these cultures. A lot of historians see Herod as an Arab on both sides. His mother was Arab and his father was Arab, both from different sides of the coin, both from different parts of the Arab world, one from the old Arab world and one from the new. This further clouds Herod's legitimacy to rule. Antipater marries a Nabatean noblewoman named Cypros. This gained Antipater a lot of favour among the Nabateans. It also forged a very strong friendship with the Nabatean king, King Atreus, who was a relative of Cypros. Antipater and Cypros had 5 children, the eldest being Phasael, then coming Herod, Joseph and Pharos, and a girl named Salome. So Antipater and Atreus get along like a house on fire, so much so that Antipater trusted his children with him when he went to war. He's forging a very strong bond with a Nabatean king. Might this have done some damage to his credibility in the eyes of the Jewish population? Probably. He was obviously friendly with a rival king. Not so much a rival king, but a king from a different part of the world. An Arab king and not a Jewish king. But on the other hand, it gains trust politically among the people who are half and half. They have families that have deep Jewish roots. So this also could have been a good thing. So fast forwarding a bit, Antipater is now governor of Idumea, serving under King Alexander Genasus. the third son of John Hyrcanussus, under his second wife. Yeah, I told you this gets very complex with these names and people. Alongside and with Queen Salome Alexandra, not to get confused with his daughter Salome. Salome is a very common name. It's probably as common as Sarah or Jane is today. So time for a quick backstory to Alexander and Alexandra. Very similar sounding names. A lot of confusion. So this is from Wikipedia, but I just want to give a very quick bio to these two, and we can move on. When Aristobulus I, Hyrcanus's son by his first wife, became king, he deemed it necessary for his own security to imprison his half-brother Aristobulus. This is obviously a different Aristobulus. Aristobulus died after a reign of 1 year. Upon his death, his widow, Salome Alexandra, had Alexander and his brothers released from prison. One of these brothers is said to have unsuccessfully sought the throne. Alexander, as the oldest living brother, had the right not only to the throne, but also to Salome, the widow of his deceased brother, who had died childless. And although she was 13 years older than him, he married her in accordance with Jewish law. So these two were also the proud parents of the bickering and feuding heirs to the throne, Hyrcanussus II and Aristobulus II. Obviously not to get confused with the first Hyrcanussus and Aristobulus. Yeah, these names are extremely confusing. They all pretty much sound the same. Why couldn't they have just named their kids Bob, Bill, Jeffrey? It would have been a hell of a lot more simple. But they all seem to be named after a grandfather or a father, great-grandfather, or a brother's son or something like that. Aristobulus served as high priest from 66 to 62 BC, and Hyrcanussus II serves as high priest in 62 BC. Aristobulus starts a war with his brother, which plunges the Jewish world into a dark and a very bloody civil war, after his mother dies. So he's coming for the throne hard. He wants total power for himself. Essentially, he's gone to war with his own brother just to get it. This really does start to sound like an episode of Game of Thrones, even though I don't particularly like that show that much. It's a good show, but it's not my favourite. This is a similar thing we're seeing playing out here. Two rival warring siblings who can't get along, who don't want to share, and want to take their ball and go home when one of them doesn't get their own way. So while these two are at each other's throats trying to kill each other, they don't see the Romans sneaking up on them. So you also got to think with these two, how many innocent lives, not only of just the people living in these cities and the surrounding areas, but how many innocent soldiers' lives and cities are lost in the process of this civil war? You essentially got first brother and neighbour fighting neighbour. All for what? One brother can sit on the throne and the other one can still live a pretty lavish, extravagant life, but he's not going to have absolute power. It seems pretty pointless in a modern perspective, but I don't know, I guess things were different back then. The Romans weren't going to sit on the sideline and let all this tax-free action and all these treasures slip right through their fingers. The brothers eventually make up and put on a public display of reconciliation at the temple. And this is the temple, what would become the Temple Mount, in the centre of Jerusalem. Aristobulus becomes king and Hyrcanussus retires. However, Antipater guides and controls Hyrcanussus. This is another future leader pulling the strings of a current ruler for the betterment of people, but also for his own power. Antipater guides and controls Hyrcanussus. He advises him to leave at once. This is probably for a pretty good reason. He obviously thought that his life was in danger and he needed to get out of the area pretty quick. So this is also where Antipater's friendship with Atreus comes into play. The pair head for Petra, the Nabatean capital. There Antipater convinces Atreus to help Hyrcanussus and launches a campaign against his brother. He's kind of playing both these guys off against each other. He's a very cunning and a very smart man. Is this just to clear the chessboard of two rival leaders so he can step in? Or does he generally care about Hyrcanussus? After all, he's the guy that gave Antipater his power in the first place. Is he just merely repaying the favour, or is he just trying to eliminate one king so he can be king and then he can take Hyrcanussus' place? Or is he trying to eliminate them both and take absolute rule for himself. The thought would have had to have crossed his mind that if I'm doing this to chances are someone's probably going to try it on him. Meanwhile, Roman General Pompey is setting up shop across the border in Damascus. So Aristobulus shits himself and he flees for the safety of the walled city of Jerusalem and the fortified temple complex. Atrius and co. lay siege to the city again. There's a lot of show but not a lot of action. I don't think the brothers really wanted to go to war with one another in the first place. All this manages to do is keep both sides blind to the real threat that was fast approaching, that being the Romans. Pompey is on the move. In 64 BC, he permanently retires the Seleucid Empire and annexes Syria. So Pompey is no joke. He's coming across his border pretty fast. He's doing it with haste. He's not fucking around. He knows what he wants and he's got a plan to execute it. He's wasting no time in his pursuit for the riches that lie in to the east, and he's probably going to do whatever he takes to try and get them, whether these two brothers are at war with each other or not. So Pompey might look like a child, but he is an effective and cold military leader. He has experience and wants nothing more to live out every Roman leader's dream of taking the unspoilt riches that lay in the Near East. So it's not too hard to guess what might have happened next. The Romans come crashing down on Jerusalem like a storm. Pompey is more than happy to insert himself in the affairs of the two brothers, but not only to them but to the wider Jewish world as well. He acts as a mediator between the two brothers. Both sides send their delegations as well as their wider political and religious leaders, such as the Pharisees, one of the controlling religious groups in Jerusalem. They were there since the day zero and had a monopolistic rule on the area. The Pharisees and Sadducees had a long-standing history with each other. And if you do get into Jewish history, the Pharisees and Sadducees pop up all the time. The Pharisees send their crew, who take it as an opportunity to beg Pompey to take out the Maccabeans once and for all. Like you constantly see with these groups, everyone wants something, and everyone has an agenda they're trying to play off against each other. And every time a new power or a new empire sets foot on the scene, someone takes advantage of it to try and take out the other older dynastic power so they can take control of Jerusalem or the wider lands in Judah for themselves. So the Romans is just seen as a way of quickly alleviating the competition. So Pompey was judge, jury and executioner. Whatever he said goes. He orders the brothers to stand by and await his judgment. So what does Aristobulus do? He goes behind Pompey's back and double crosses him. Doesn't take a genius to work out that this was a stupid fucking thing to do. Aristobulus doesn't quite understand the changing power structure at the time. He doesn't understand what is taking place. He also underestimates not only Pompey, but the wider Roman Empire, and just what the consequences of that means for Judah. He's blind. He really doesn't understand the Romans. He clearly hasn't seen them as a threat and just how big the empire is and just how much of the world they were going to end up controlling. If he had a bit more foresight, he wouldn't have tried to fuck with Pompey or piss off the Romans. He doesn't quite understand that they are going to be the dominating force in the area for probably the next 1,000 years. Pompey wastes no time. He doesn't fuck about, twiddling his thumbs. He has a preemptive strike. He hits back hard and fast and besieges the city of Jerusalem, capturing Aristobulus. But this isn't enough for Pompey. He goes that one step further and he goes after the remaining Maccabean supporters, destroying the bridge that connects the city to the fortified temple in the process. He sets up his camp and digs in, laying siege to the temple for 3 months. So this must be a pretty well-designed and well-made temple. I mean, it seems to take a beating like every couple of months to at least once a year someone's besieging it, and it doesn't seem to fall that easily. It must be really well made and really well designed because it's saved many kings' lives time and time again, and pretty consistently too. So Pompey bides his time, and what he does next, it is very cunning, it's very devious, but ultimately it does work. He takes advantage of Jewish customs and attacks on the Sabbath during a fast. He storms the temple with his Roman forces. The Romans slaughter everybody in sight, those not wishing to be a casualty of Rome decide it's better to chuck themselves off the city walls than death by Roman. They burn all their possessions and homes before flinging themselves off the ramparts, leaving nothing for the Romans. So the Romans smash down the temple doors and slit the priest's throat as they guard the temple's sacred altar. Pompey also can't help but look inside the Holy of Holies. He has a look, finding out that it's just a golden candelabra and leaves the temple pretty much untouched and doesn't steal anything in the process. He also doesn't burn it to the ground or really seem to damage it. He largely leaves the Jewish religion intact. However, the damage was done. 12,000 lay dead, the fortifications of the city were destroyed, the Maccabean kingdom was no more, and the monarchy that had ruled was left shattered. Pompey returns to Rome to celebrate his victories, which leaves the door open for conflict. So now we come back to Hyrcanus. He is harassed by Aristobulus' sons, who launched a rebellion against him. He was left exposed now. He couldn't really rely on Rome's support. But never fear, Antipater is here. Antipater was the real ruler. Hyrcanus was a figurehead. He was more of the public face of Jewish leadership. But Antipater was the brains. He realized the benefit of a close relationship with Rome. Serving them served him and his people. Rome was the new power on the block, and Antipater knew it. They were here to stay, and life was much easier with them in your corner than to have them as an enemy. And I think rightly so. I think he probably did make the right decision in the end. If he didn't have the backing of the Romans, Herod wouldn't have a kingdom, and Herod's sons wouldn't have a kingdom. It also probably brought a lot of much-needed stability to the region. Back in Rome, Pompey had to learn to share. Pompey was a victim of his own success. His successes in the Eastern campaigns and the spoils he brought back from it gained the attention of the Roman world. Crassus and Caesar wanted a piece of the East pie. They also wanted to rival Pompey's victories. So for those of you that don't know, Marcus Crassus was one of the richest men in Rome. If you've seen the TV show Spartacus, he's in, I think, season 4. He's the main antagonist. In reality, he also led the campaign against the Spartacus rebellion. And Caesar is obviously Julius Caesar. I don't think the man needs much of an intro. I think everyone pretty much should know it. So just when you think everything is right and Antipater can take a couple of days off, there's another problem on the horizon. This presents Antipater with a bit of a problem. He now has to weave his way politically and diplomatically around not one, but 3 Roman rulers, all of which want a chunk of what essentially is his empire. So before he just had to deal with Pompey, now it's Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. At the same time, Antipater is in a good position to excel in his own career. He was savvy and proved very useful to Hyrcanus II, or should I say, was very useful in steering Hyrcanus in the direction that he wanted him to go. He was also proved to be a valuable ally and very resourceful to the Romans. He was crafty politically, resourceful, and very tactful militarily. Antipater rises through the ranks, later becoming a client of Pompey, the Roman general, after his conquering of Judah in the name of the Republic. Antipater has a foothold, and everything seems to be going his way. That is, until the Roman world is plunged into war again. Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey all go to war with one another, throwing Antipater and the Jewish world into unpredictability once again. So it's not just the political infighting of the Jewish world, it's not just Aristobulus and Hyrcanus that have a civil war with each other, it's also Rome. The only difference is that Rome's civil war will have a far-reaching effect on those of which who aren't Roman. This is a complex and intriguing time, and the Roman infighting makes its way to Egypt. Caesar and Pompey go at it, Pompey is defeated and retreats to Egypt. Caesar is in hot pursuit, arriving a few days later only to find the Egyptians have already murdered Pompey. They then deliver his head to Caesar. Caesar just happened to arrive in Egypt at the same time Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VIII had become bitterly divided in an internal power struggle as who would deliver and align themselves with Rome and give it the greatest prize of the region, that being Egypt. Cleopatra wastes no time, seeing Caesar as an opportunity she'd been waiting for, to not only solidify her own rule, but also to to take control of Egypt. She seduces Caesar, who falls for her. She bears him a child, they have a son, and all is right in the Roman world. Meanwhile, Caesar wins the fight over Pompey. Antipater's friend is dead, and he needs to act pretty quick, as he has backed the wrong horse, and he needs to use every political trick in the book to get himself out of this one. So Antipater does the only thing he really can. He aligns himself with Caesar. So Rome and Egypt are now joined at the hip. Rome had Cleopatra's back, but it was not to last. The Egyptians rise up against Cleopatra and her pro-Roman rule. So the people of Judah weren't the only ones that didn't like Roman rule. This seems to be another reoccurring theme. The Romans do piss off a lot of people wherever they go. I guess people just don't like being told what to do by outside parties. So Caesar's back is well and truly up against the wall. But at the same time, this is kind of his own fault. He did get himself into this situation. He does let himself get seduced by Cleopatra. She gets her hooks into him, and he kind of lets this happen. He gets in too deep to the point that he can't just up and pull his troops out of there and let the people take back Egypt. That's gone too far for that. So he really, at this point, has no choice but to help her. She is the mother of his son, and he needs the help. So the Romans back Egypt when the people rise up against their rule. Cleopatra also has a lot of romantic dealings with many powerful Romans. Caesar isn't the first, and he's not the last. So she's just playing the Romans off against each other. After all the Roman armies seem to find themselves going through Egypt in one way or another. It's a staging location for Roman troops. Whenever the Romans besiege Jerusalem, they always get troops from Egypt. I guess it's probably the natural route to take through the Mediterranean. But she definitely knows what she's doing. She's definitely playing a very dangerous political game. All these Romans find themselves going through Egypt. She plays her game. And all of them are either dead not long after meeting her, which also includes itself. So Caesar fucks up. He finds himself stuck in Alexandria and besieged when the people rise up against Cleopatra. Antipater also hears opportunity knocking. He sees this as a way of gaining Caesar's trust and his favour. This serves Antipater. He comes and saves Caesar. He can expand his kingdom. The kingdom's been proven to be pretty unstable without Roman backing. This would make his reign a hell of a lot easier. So Antipater comes to the rescue of Caesar. He arrives with 3,000 reinforcements made up of Jewish and allied forces from around the surrounding areas. He attacks Caesar's enemies and well and truly saves his ass. He also convinces Egyptian Jews to fight for him and lend their support. So this is another prime example of Antipater's diplomacy, but also his political skill. He just seemingly can get anyone to follow him no matter what. He's getting Jews in another country who have never even met him to support Caesar and Cleopatra. This is probably also made easier by his half-Jewish origins, but ultimately you have to say it's his political and diplomatic skill that wins him the favour, not his heritage. He's proving again that he is a very capable leader. He's a very smart and cunning man. He seizes the day and he wins Caesar's favour. Cleopatra can rule unhindered and Caesar's opponents are defeated. It's a win-win for everybody. All three parties get what they want. For his actions in battle, Antipater is rewarded. Caesar makes Antipater the chief minister of Judah. Judah is now on the Roman radar, which in turn makes it a tax-paying Roman province and a cash cow for Rome. A lot of wealth comes through the region. It's also a very big trading port. It's also in a prime location to deal with the east and the west. Antipater's actions in Egypt are fucking huge. This event here is probably the single most important decision of his entire life. Whether he knew or predicted what the outcome might have been for himself and for the people of Judah, we will never really know. However, this commitment to help Caesar in his time of need had a multi-generational effect. Antipater couldn't have known that helping the new emperor would have worked out so well in his favour. In the process of assisting Caesar, Antipater was setting up the Herodian dynasty and preparing the future for his son's rule, fast-tracking Herod's kingdom and his relationship with the Romans. The relationship with the Romans was cemented. He helped them, he got the Roman backing, and now he's the chief minister of Judah. No one can doubt his ability to rule or his legitimacy to the throne. Antipater is managing the region. He not only is a capable and diplomatic ruler, but like I just mentioned during this process, he sets up the Herodian dynasty. Antipater is also allowed to rebuild Jerusalem's walls and defences. That's also a pretty big thing. If the Romans didn't trust him, they wouldn't allow him to fortify the city again. After all, if anything goes wrong, he can just pull back to the city and to the temple and wait out a siege. If the Romans were that concerned about him, they would have put powers in place and probably have stationed a garrison there permanently, making sure no one could refortify and go hide if things went wrong. There's a large amount of trust being exchanged on both sides. He also instills his sons as regional governors. The chess pieces are definitely moving. This is either a completely random coincidence or part of a methodical plan. He had to have known what he was doing. He wouldn't have instilled his sons as local rulers if he hadn't planned on one of them succeeding him one day. Is this part of a plan to dominate the entire area through a multi-generational dynasty? Or was this just an ego thing, or did he generally think his sons were capable rulers? Was this bad or good? Is he doing this for the good of the people, or is it for himself? You always have to ask questions when people want to take power of something. The eldest son, Faz, or however you pronounce it, is made governor of Jerusalem, and Herod is appointed governor of Galilee. So back to Herod for a minute. From an early age, Herod proved to be a solid leader. At age 15, he hunted down and eliminated a group of fanatical Jewish rebels, killing them in the process. However, this did upset a few people due to the killings being unauthorized. The Sanhedrin of Jerusalem were outraged by Herod's actions and demanded he stand trial for his crimes. As luck would have it, his father's good standing and assistance to Rome pays off. It's not the last time that the Romans will get the family out of trouble. The Romans ordered that Herod was to be acquitted of his crimes. In fact, he was actually given greater power appointed to him by Rome. It definitely looks like Antipater and Herod were just the rulers that Rome wanted. But not only that, they were the rulers that Rome needed. Firm but fair, no bullshit, but still lenient enough not to upset everybody. This is extremely important in a region so turbulent. They were the perfect balance of what Rome needed. Both sides are using the other side to get what they want. What Rome wants works out for Antipater and Herod, and what Antipater and Herod wants works out for Rome. It's one of the first times in history that the Romans just haven't subjugated their rule onto an area and completely controlled it. There is a lot of leniency and a lot of freedoms being granted here. This pisses people off, yes, but at the same time, is it that bad of a thing? Because the region is probably going to be a hell of a lot worse off without them. So back to Antipater. Just when everything seems right in the world, someone goes ahead and whacks Caesar. This puts Antipater in an awkward spot. His friend is dead, again, and he's now forced to side with the enemy. This is history repeating itself. So Antipater is left with two choices. He can back Cassius or Mark Antony. He takes sides with Gaius Cassius Longinus in his conflict against Mark Antony. Cassius was head conspirator in the conspiracy against Caesar. He was also one of Caesar's assassins, so this is a guy that will go to any lengths to secure power. He is also, by most accounts, a complete fucking prick. He was also gunning for all the power and wealth he could get his hands on, and resort to just taking someone else's wealth, usually killing them in the process. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome and the governor of Syria. Antipater's backing and the love of the Romans and their politics leads to a lot of friction among the locals, especially non-devout Hellenized Jews. These tensions are made worse by the constant demand for Roman tributes and taxes under Cassius's rule. Destiny was about to intervene in a very big way. Antipater's constant switching of allegiances and backing of Rome pissed a lot of people off, especially the Jewish elites. Combined with Cassius's demand for tribute, troops, and general cuntiness, this was a recipe for disaster. He put in place harsh practices to ensure the tributes were met, like selling city curators and entire cities into slavery. He demanded Jew to pay 700 talents, which Antipater paid, splitting the cost with Herod and Fazel. This in turn leads to Antipater's death. An aristocrat named Malichus upset Cassius by not collecting the tributes he was charged with. Cassius is furious and wants Machias's head. Antipater steps in and saves his life by paying the 100 talents difference out of his own pocket. See, Antipater, he's more or less a good guy. He doesn't want to see people get hurt. Yes, he does have a lust for power and he wants to rule, but he seems like a pretty decent guy. This moves things over with Cassius, but Malichus is a prick who has a very deep and bitter hatred for Antipater, based on his alliances with Rome. And despite Antipater saving him from a probably very painful death, Malichus spikes his drink and poisons Antipater. There are a few reasons as to why he did this. Josephus, our historian friend, gives us two choices, one being he wanted to help secure the throne for Hyrcanus and beat Herod, who was on the rise. The second is he wanted power for himself by getting rid of Hyrcanus as quickly as possible. So he bribes one of Hyrcanus' servants while they were gathered, presumably at one of Hyrcanus' estates or at a party or something, essentially murdering him. I think the second choice is most likely true. Malichus rules for a very short period of time in Jerusalem, but doesn't really do much else after that. He's pretty much a grain of sand on the beach. He doesn't do a hell of a lot and he doesn't really achieve much. Now we come down to the main event. The stage is now set for Herod to take power. His father's murder would not go unanswered. This is very early on in Herod's reign. This is basically the start of his career. His mental state is just about to go on the decline. He's been pretty stable the last couple of years, but maybe it was the murder of his father, him being pushed into power. This is where we see the first signs of him starting to struggle mentally. So Herod largely has his father to thank for his quick rise to power. He and his brother were given their positions as governor when both of them were still pretty young. Antipater had been a friend to Rome, which also helped smooth the transition of power over. More or less, the Romans didn't have to go looking for a sympathetic ruler that could act in their favour. They already had a dynastic succession plan lined up. You get rid of Antipater, Herod takes over, or Phasael takes over, or one of the other sons. Herod and Phasael were obviously the best choices. Herod, refining that further, Herod was the best choice. Herod became the governor of Galilee around the age of 25 to 28 years old. Some older ancient Greek sources put his age at around 15, as I mentioned above. I think early to mid-20s is probably more realistic. So Herod from a young age had all the makings of a great leader. He possessed, according to Josephus, blessed with every gift of looks, body and mind. Herod was sophisticated and charming. He worked his magic on the Romans and impressed them greatly with his leadership qualities. He was raised in a very privileged home, obviously. His father obviously wasn't a poor man. He was from a very wealthy background. I wouldn't quite say elite background, but he was definitely well off. He learned a lot about ruling from his father. Once again, that's pretty obvious. He was a very smart, cunning and educated man. He knew his Greek, Jewish and Latin histories. He also knew a lot about their culture and philosophy. He even debated in these subjects when he had free time away from the political arena. He also had a very big passion in architecture and building, which would come into play later in his life. Josephus also calls him a slave to his passions. He was known as a bit of a ladies' man with a very large sexual appetite. Herod has such a vast and dramatic duality to his character. He is on both ends of the extreme scale. For all his positives, Herod is balanced out by an equal amount of negatives. He could be sympathetic and visionary, but he could also be murderous and insane. He could be paranoid, but he could also be diplomatic, political, and very analytical in his dealings with other people. But behind the scenes, his personal life was a complete clusterfuck. Relationship-wise, it was just a fucking minefield. If he wasn't looking to take someone out in his family, there was probably someone looking to take him out, which also feeds into his paranoia and his mental state. But one of his biggest problems, and one that will follow him around forever, is Herod's Achilles' heel, that being his lust for power. Power would control and corrupt his family and his personal life. It destroyed his close relationships and would eventually elevate to murder and an unforgivable set of events. On the other hand, was this all Herod's fault? Is it a simple case of absolute power corrupts all? I'm not 100% convinced on this. I think there's a lot of external factors that also played into Herod. I think he was probably that right balance of good, bad, both ends of the extreme scale. But I think a lot of external factors do have a lot to do with with his paranoia and a lot of his mental state. Herod was raised in a very rich household, but it was also a very brutal one. Despite the lavish lifestyle, he saw the rise and fall of family members and the use of death, murder and violence as a way of achieving political goals. This brings up the question, is it nature or nurture? Is his mental state by birth, or was it just what he was used to? Was this a cultural thing? Was the culture of his household violent and brutal? From an early age, this is just how he learned to deal with problems. And in his adult life, as we see with people today, they always go back to what happened in their childhood. Is he merely just pulling from the playbook of the early years of Herod? Oh, well, my father, used to murder people he didn't like who got in the way of his power, so I'm going to do exactly the same thing. It's the whole nature over nurture argument. He's generally described by pretty much every historian and ancient source as being paranoid. And this is a definite reoccurring theme with every historical source about Herod, is the paranoia. So this isn't something that has just been made up to create this character of Herod. He generally seems to suffer from paranoia right throughout his life. During his time as governor, he efficiently and consistently collects taxes for the Roman Senate. This is most likely where the picture of Herod being a puppet of Rome began to form. Like his father, he serves Rome well. Herod knows the value of a close-knit relationship with Rome and what this would bring. He's not stupid. All roads go through Rome now, so to be a problem for the Romans would mean not only Herod, but the people of Judah would probably be wiped out in the process. If you were a problem to Rome, you were taken out militarily and you were taken out pretty quick. Or you would be subjugated to harsh penalties as a consequence of this. If he was a problem for Rome, or prevented Rome from achieving their ultimate goal, which was the acquiring of riches and wealth from the area and land, he would have a very big bullseye on his chest. He probably would have been treated the same way as a lot of the other empires that got in Rome's way. So Herod could trust Rome, but more importantly, Rome could trust Herod. This is the old, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back scenario. As I mentioned, he's referred by historians as being a Roman stooge. I don't necessarily agree with that, largely because he doesn't really have much of a choice. Like I just mentioned, it was get along or get annihilated. That was really his only two options, and as we'll see later in the story, those that resisted Rome, yeah, they could hold out, they could go to war with Rome, but ultimately at this time, Rome just had more resources than everybody else. They had bigger armies, they had better engineering, and they would come down on you like a fucking plague if you got in their way. And Judah isn't known for its great armies or its outstanding generals and warriors. Not to mention, Herod probably doesn't have an army big enough to counteract a Roman attack. He would largely be relying on the support of the other regions of the area, who all don't really seem to like him that much. After all, he is, in a lot of people's eyes, not legitimate to rule the throne of Judah. This would get him some support, and it would garner some sympathy from some of the groups that don't like him. But how many have his back when the shit hits the fan? When they have 100,000 Romans invading Jerusalem and pushing these people out of the region, and they want to take over and subjugate their own quote unquote Roman stooges leader, how many would have his back when the battle begins? They're just as likely to switch sides and join the Romans just so they can take power themselves. So this is a very tough situation Herod finds himself in, and if he doesn't take the sides of the Romans, someone else will. Just under his rule, the people are probably safer than without him. And as I keep mentioning, this is a very turbulent region, and he would probably be forced back to Idumea and back to the safety of Petra, and probably to be exiled or even killed. And then that would probably make him a target. He'd probably have a bounty out on him. Who knows? If Herod doesn't get along with Rome, someone else will. If he's a Roman stooge for having Roman interests at heart, well, I guess he's a stooge. But Herod is a lot smarter than that. I think he's doing this for the benefit of his own people, but also for himself and his family. So after his father's murder by Malichus, there's a lot of history between these two. Herod strikes back. So for more on his rise to power, we will have a look at the accounts of Josephus in his works, The Jewish War. So this is chapter 2, Herod's rise to power. Soon after this, Antigonus, son of Aristobulus, had an interview with Caesar, which had the unexpected result of winning Antipater further advancement. His wisest course would have been to express grief for his father, who was thought to have been poisoned because of his differences with Pompey, and indignation at Scipio's brutal treatment of his brother, not to mix his appeals for sympathy with an outburst of bitterness. But he went on to accuse Hyrcanus and Antipater openly, alleging that in a most indignacious fashion they had driven him and his sisters right out of their native land, that in their insolence they had treated the whole nation outrageously, that they had sent assistance to Caesar in Egypt not out of loyalty to him, but through fear springing from old differences and in the hope that their friendship with Pompey would be forgotten. He's obviously referring to the Caesar and Pompey's war. Antipater reported by throwing off his garments and exposing his countless scars. Of his loyalty to Caesar, he said he needed say nothing, his body shouted it aloud without his saying a word. The imprudence of Antigonus past belief. The son of an enemy of Rome, and a fugitive from Rome, inheriting from his father a craving for revolution and sedition, he had a source to accuse other people before the Roman commander, and to try and feather his own nest when he was lucky to be alive! Exclamation point. His present lust for power did not arise from his being in want. His ambition was to stir up sedition among the Jews, and so to bite the hand that fed him. Having listened to both, Caesar declared Hyrcanus the better candidate for the high priesthood, and allowed Antipater to choose his own office. Antipater left it to the best over of the honour to decide its magnitude, and he was appointed commissioner for all Judah with authority to rebuild the demolished walls of the mother city. These honours Caesar ordered to be engraved in the capital to commemorate his own justice and Antipater's splendid services. As soon as Antipater had escorted Caesar out of Palestine, he returned to Judah. There he began by re-erecting the wall of the capital which Pompey had demolished, and proceeded to suppress disturbances in the various parts of the country, using every case both threats and advice. If they supported Hyrcanus, they would live in prosperity and quiet, enjoying their own property and general peace. But if they were deluded by the frigid hopes of those who, for private profit, were eager for revolution, they would find him not a protector but a master. Hyrcanus not a king, but an autocrat, and Caesar and the Romans not leaders and friends but enemies. They would never stand by while the Jews turned out of office the man they had appointed. While he talked in his way, he was organizing the country along his own lines. Knowing that Hyrcanus was too lethargic and spineless to be a real king, Phasael, the eldest son, he appointed governor of Jerusalem and district. The next one, Herod, he sent with equal authority into Galilee, though he was quite young, so maybe he was 15 after all. Herod, overflowing with energy, soon found scope for his active spirit, finding that Hezekiah, a bandit chief, was overrunning the district adjoining Syria with a very large gang. He caught and executed him, along with many of his bandits. This stroke won Herod the gratitude of the Syrians. In all the villages and all the towns his praises were sung. Had he not won back for them their peace and property? A further result was that he became known as Sextus Caesar, a kinsman of the great Caesar and governor of Syria. His reputation also served to arouse a spirit of friendly rivalry in his brother Phasael, who became steadily more popular in Jerusalem and by force of personality kept the city quiet without any blundering misuse of his power. Consequently, Antipater was revered by the nation as if he were king, and honoured by all as undisputed head of the state, yet his own loyalty and faithlessness to Hyrcanus remain unchanged. But in prosperity there is no way of avoiding jealousy. Hyrcanus, though he did not show it, was cut to the heart by the fame of the young men. He was grieved most of all by Herod's achievements, and by the stream of messages announcing one success after another. His bitterness was aggravated by the malignity of numerous courtiers. Offended by the moderation either of the sons or of Antipater, to the three of them had gone by default the management of affairs, while Hyrcanassus sat helpless, retaining only the name of king, without the authority. Obviously he's pissed off Rome. How long would he be so foolish as to rear the kings to his own hurt? They no longer pretended to be viceroys, but were the unquestioned heads of the state. While he had ceased to count, for without his giving any order, verbal or written, Herod had put all of these people to death in defiance of Jewish law. If he was not king but a private citizen still, he ought to be put in the dock and in the king's presence justify his breach of the ancestral laws, which forbade execution without trial. By those suggestions, Hyrcanassus was gradually inflamed, and at least in an outburst of fury he sent for Herod to stand his trial. Advised by his father and emboldened by the success of his own policy, Herod posted garrisons about Galilee and presented himself in Jerusalem, accompanied by a strong escort, not so swollen a force as to suggest the intention of dethroning Hyrcanassus, nor small enough to leave him helpless in the face of jealousy. But Sextus Caesar, fearing that the young man would run into a hornet's nest, sent Hyrcanassus a categorical order to acquit Herod of the charge of homicide. The king, who as an admirer of Herod was in any case anxious to do this, found him not guilty. Herod, believing that the king was mortified by his escape, withdrew to Sextus' headquarters in Damascus, with the intention of disobeying if summoned again. The malignant courtiers renounced their incitement of Hyrcanassus, alleging that Herod had gone away in a rage and was ready to attack him. Swallowing the bait, the king was at a loss as what to do, as he saw the superiority of his opponent. But when Sextus Caesar actually appointed Herod commander-in-chief of Cola Syria and Samaria, and not only the loyalty of the people, but the forces at his disposal made him formidable, Hyrcanassus was paralyzed with fear, every minute expecting Herod to march against him with an army at his back. And he guessed right. Herod, furious at the threat implied in his trial, collected an army and set out for Jerusalem to dethrone Hyrcanassus. And he would soon have done it if his father and brother had not hurried out and calmed him down, urging him to confine his revenge to threats and ferocity and to spare the king under whom he had grown so powerful. If he felt sore at being put in the dock, he ought at the same time to be grateful of his acquittal, and not when the sword had been hanging over his head, to be ungrateful for his escape. And if it was true that the war god held the balance, Herod's military strength would have been outweighed by the wrong he was doing. So he had better not to be certain of victory when he was going to join battle with his king and comrade, often his benefactor, who had never been harsh, except when he had been driven by malignant advisers to try and scare him with the shadow of injustice. Thus advised, Herod gave way, satisfied that he had made his future secure by giving the people a demonstration of his power. When, however, Cassius was out of the way, Malichus was so far from showing gratitude to Antipater, devised a plot against the man who had often saved him. Anxious as he was to remove this obstacle to his career of crime, Antipater, alarmed at the strength and cunning of the man, crossed the Jordan, with the intention of raising a force to crush the plot. Caught in the act, Malichus, by sheer impudence, got the better of Antipater's sons, Phasael, warden of Jerusalem, and Herod, responsible for arms and equipment, were deceived by a stream of excesses and oaths into undertaking to intercede on his behalf with their father. Thus Malichus was saved a second time by Antipater, who pursued Marcus, the governor of Syria, to abandon his intention of executing him as a revolutionary. When the war was declared on Cassius and Brutus by young Caesar and Antony, Cassius and Marcus raised an army in Syria, and as they hoped for valuable assistance from Herod, they put him They put him for the time being in charge of Cold Syria, with a body of horse and foot under his command, Cassius promising that when the war was won he would make him king of Judah. Antipater's destruction was the direct outcome of an actual and prospective dominance of his son. Fearing Herod's rise, Malichus bribed one of his royal cupbearers to give Antipater poison. It was a triumph for this scheming Malichus, for after the banquet Antipater died. He had at all times shown energy and an initiative in the management of affairs, but all in putting Hyrcanus back on his throne and keeping him there. Malichus suspected of the poisoning, quieted the angry citizens by denying it and made himself more secure by raising a body of infantry. He did not suppose that Herod would take it lying down, and indeed Herod arrived almost instantaneously with an army to avenge his father. But his brother Phasael advised him not to settle accounts with the man openly, for fear of provoking a riot. He accepted Malichus's explanation for the time being, and agreed that no suspicion attached to him. Then he performed the funeral rites for his father with magnificent ceremonial. He next turned his attention to Samaria, which was torn by party strife, and after putting matters there to rights, turned back to Jerusalem to attend the feast, accompanied by his armed forces. Hyrcanus, at the insistence of Malichus, who had panicked at Herod's approach, sent orders that he was not to bring foreigners among the nationals. When they were purified, Herod showed his contentment for his pretext and for the man who issued the order by entering during the night. Malichus again approached him and bewildered Antipater. Herod met cunning with cunning, though he could hardly contain his anger. But he sent letters deploring his father's murder to Cassius, who hated Malichus already. Cassius wrote back that he should settle accounts with his father's killer, and gave secret instructions to his tribunes to help Herod pay a debt of honor. Oh, this is getting serious. If this is getting boring for people, just feel free to fast forward to the next section. After Cassius's capture of Laodicea, the leading men of every district gathered at his headquarters, bringing him crowns and other gifts. This was the moment chosen by Herod for his revenge. Malichus was suspicious, and when he was in Tyre, where his son was held as hostage, he determined to get him out by stealth, and made arrangements for his own escape to Judah. His slender chances of survival acted as a spur. His ambitions soared, and he saw himself leading his nation in revolt against the Romans, while Cassius has had his hands full with the war against Mark Antony, and setting the crown of his own brow after quickly disposing of Hyrcanus. Fate had the last laugh. Herod, perceiving his game, invited him and Hyrcanus to dinner, and then calling one of his attendant slaves, sent him home as if to prepare the meal, but really to warn the tribunes to come out and put the ambush into effect. They had not forgotten Cassius's instructions and came out to the seashore in front of the city, sword in hand, and there surrounded Malichus and hacked him to death. Hyrcanus promptly fainted from shock and collapsed. When at last he recovered consciousness, he asked Herod who had killed Malichus. One of the tribunes answered, Cassius's orders. Then Cassius replied, Hyrcanus has saved me and my country too, by destroying the mortal enemy of both. Whether he really thought this, or was too frightened to dispute an accomplished fact, will never be known. Anyway, Herod's account with Malichus was now settled. When Cassius withdrew from Syria, strife again broke out in Jerusalem. Helix, backed by a body of soldiers, rose against Phasael with the intention of avenging Malichus by punishing Herod through his brother. As it happened, Herod was with Fabius, the Roman general, at Damascus, awesome name, and though anxious to help, he was immobilized by sickness. Meanwhile, Phasael overpowered Helix without assistance and denounced the ingratitude of Hyrcanus in collaboration with Helix and permitting Malichus' brother to seize the forts. He had indeed seized many of these, among them the strongest of all, Masada, but he was helpless against the might of Herod, who, as soon as he was well again, recaptured all the forts and kicked him out of Masada, grovelling. So we'll come back to Josephus a little later. This is the first political assassination, and one that is driven by revenge. But at the same time, it was also a strategic killing that would work in his favour. Herod is young, ambitious, and lusting for power. He had become friendly with the Roman governor of Syria, Sextus Caesar, Julius Caesar's cousin. This relationship pays off. Sextus appoints Herod general of Samaria and Syria. Essentially, Herod is expanding his territory and his influence. He's doubling the size of his kingdom. Like Antipater, is he doing this for fame and fortune and glory, or is he trying to build a better future and make Judah a more peaceful and prosperous place? I think you can rule out him trying to unify the different groups in the area, because there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. But this is definitely a deliberate move. Like we've seen with other rulers in his position, is this just opportunity knocking? So Herod doesn't let anything stand in his way to taking control. He is not afraid to play dirty. He will even go as far as killing those around him in order to do so. This includes political rivals, but for the most part, Herod takes aim at members of his own family to consolidate his power. Is this where the Massacre of Innocents has come from? He kills members of his own family. Is this where all the stories of the insane Herod came from? Was this his plan all along, or are we seeing the first stages of a disturbed and psychotic mind? Or was this just a good excuse to take out a rival that was implicated in his father's death? Herod definitely has an axe to grind with Hyrcanassus, as it was he who demanded Herod stand trial for the murder after he had the bandits put to death, as one of the first controversial acts as a ruler, and essentially his first politically motivated killing. He's also fast gaining a very brutal reputation as a ruler that is not to be fucked with. But this doesn't sit right with everyone. As mentioned before, he upsets the Sanhedrin and other ruling elites in the area. So moving along. The year is 41 BC, and Mark Antony names the brothers as tetrarchs charged with supporting Hyrcanassus II. Not long after, drama ensues when Hyrcanassus' nephew Antigonus takes the throne from his uncle with the backing of the Parthians. The Parthians launch an attack on Syria and Palestine, taking back provinces as they sweep through the region. This is a turbulent and dangerous time for Herod, and Judah in general. The death of his father caused a power vacuum that was going to be filled by the strongest and most capable leader. The throne was open to all who were bold enough to take it. Unfortunately for Herod, most of the threats come from his own family, which might explain why he murders so many of them later on. During the Parthian invasion, Jerusalem falls and is invaded. Hyrcanassus and Phasael are captured. During the battle, Hyrcanassus has his ears bitten off by his nephew Antigonus II. The purpose of this was so he can never again rule as a high priest. This basically disqualifies him from the office. This takes Hyrcanassus off the chessboard. Herod's brother Phasael tops himself rather than die at the hands of Antigonus. Herod would undoubtedly know that Antigonus and the Parthians would come for him next. So Herod takes the remainder of his family and waits out the storm in the fortress of Masada. Herod makes a tactful and calculated escape, fleeing, seeking out help in Petra. So this all goes back to his father's relationship with King Atreus. He was very friendly with the Nabateans and was no stranger to Petra. Needless to say, he doesn't get any help, so he turns to the one constant and reliable source of help, the Romans. Antigonus takes the throne of Jerusalem, and the Hasmonean dynasty had been reinstated, and Herod's rule is now on life support. Herod really has to lift his game, he has to do something, and he has to do something pretty quick. So Herod travels to Rome and pleads/negotiates for the reinstatement of John Hyrcanassus. So, why would he want this guy reinstated? For one, his father worked for him, but like Antipater, he's a integral part of the plan. He's a lot easier to control than someone else being put in power. This is kind of a tactical move on Herod's part. Antipater controlled Hyrcanassus, and it looks like Herod wants to do the same thing. Instate a ruler that most of the people like. They can't obviously question his origins, but really the real power comes from behind the scenes, with Herod pulling the strings and making the decisions. Hyrcanassus is now just a chess piece again. He's the public face of leadership, not the brains. So Judah had become of great importance to Rome. Since the time of Pompey's conquering of Jerusalem in 63 BC, Since then, it was part of the extended empire's region of influence and more than likely seen as another revenue stream for Rome. It was far too important and profitable to let it fall back to the way it had been managed before. Once again, Rome needed Herod and Herod needed Rome. The choice was simple: give Herod the help he needed in order to keep the balance of power. While he was in Rome, Herod was surprised to learn that the Roman Senate declared him King of the Jews in 40 BC, much to the support of Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's nephew and heir. So this also goes back to, this is Rome's power over its subjects. Whatever they say goes. They had the power to institute their own ruler. They obviously wanted things done naturally, and this wasn't happening. There was too much infighting. Herod was technically the leader, now he's just been deposed. Now the Romans have got to step in and make a very big and calculated play. They were also probably very sick of the internal bickering and the power struggles of the Jewish world. If they wanted this region to work out, they needed stability, and Herod was that stable option. Things are definitely heating up. The Roman world is going to go to war with the Jewish world, and things will probably not be the same. So now Herod returns to Judah on a mission and with a new resolve, to take back the kingdom for himself. There were a few obstacles in his way. Some were physical, some people. Other barriers were his Idumean and Arabian mixed heritage. He was not viewed as worthy to lead by the elites. Idumea had only recently been incorporated into the Judean kingdom, and thus was not looked upon as a legitimate worthy part of Judah. Herod has always been an outsider to the ruling elite, and very little had changed. Herod was still an outsider and an outsider in his own empire. But by far, the biggest issue for Herod, and the biggest issue standing in his way, was probably his own mind. On the other hand, Hyrcanassus was a good choice for the high priesthood. Herod had nominated him for the role in the first place, and he was more than qualified and experienced for the job. After his removal from office and Herod's promotion by Rome, the stage was set for a new ruler, but this was still not enough to convince the elite conservative priest classes. Herod was viewed as unqualified for the job, meaning that his kingship and high priesthood would need to be divided. He wasn't seen fit to rule because he was half Jewish. That's why his rule would have to be divided. He was only half fit for the job. It's a little insulting given that he has made it this far. This was a pretty serious situation. If he couldn't hold the office of high priesthood, he couldn't rule on grounds that his adopted Jewish beliefs were not as strong as first thought. This means that his rivals for the high priesthood were much more qualified and better suited for the job, based solely on religious beliefs. Herod's biggest obstacle at present was Antigonus. He was in the crosshairs. Herod's transition to power was anything but smooth sailing. But this is Herod we're talking about, and nothing is going to stop him. But nothing is going to stand in his way of obtaining power. This could be an argument as to why he's so brutal. He simply just has to prove himself. No one believes he can lead. No one thinks he's legitimate. Half the population doesn't think he can lead, and the other half don't think he's legitimate enough to lead. So maybe this is the way he shows that he's a capable leader, by being brutal and just essentially getting shit done. Herod's objective was to take back Jerusalem. Was this just a political stunt? Was he just going to turn up and let the Romans do the fighting while Herod takes the credibility? He's seen as the hero in front of the population that was still inside of the city. He looks like the hero who takes back the city for the Jews. So the city had risen up against his rule and rejected the Roman influence. There were crowds of supporters that welcomed Antigonus and the Parthian prince. They celebrated the return of Maccabean rule. What follows next is more or less a ruse. The Parthians act as a mediator between Herod and Antigonus. This buys them time to initiate their plan. They lure out Herod's brother, Phasael, capturing him in a trap. The city is looted and Antigonus is instated as king of Judah. Herod's brother is murdered, or did he kill himself? Because there's been some sources that have suggested that he was reported as killing himself, but he was actually murdered by either Antigonus or some of his men. Pretty much on the grounds that unless he found a new way to kill himself by bashing his brains out, that would have been a very, very hard way to try and kill yourself. Herod is devastated, his city was lost and his brother was dead, and the Parthians had now won. Herod breaks down and nearly cracks under the pressure. But his power, will to live, and his smarts and cunning keep him in the game. He retreats back to Egypt. He stops in the hills for a night while Antigonus's cavalry is in pursuit. Herod tries to kill himself before his guards stop him. He is on the run with his mother, his new fiancée, Miriam, and sister. He eventually takes them to Masada to wait out the war. The cavalry catch up to Herod, but he defeats them and continues to Egypt, where he meets up with Cleopatra, as mentioned by Josephus. Mark Antony has just left for Rome. Cleopatra asks Herod to stay, but he knows what needs to be done. He leaves for Rome not long after in order to seek out Mark Antony's favour. What happens next changes the tide. Mark Antony realises the delicate and rapidly changing nature of the situation. Rome couldn't afford to lose Judah, and it was far too important. Antony was planning a full-scale war to get rid of the Parthians once and for all. But there was something missing in his plan. The region couldn't be solidified without a strong and brutal leader. Herod was waning mentally, and he needed a psychological boost. Antony realises this job requires a competent leader and not a boy with the confidence problem. So he comes up with a plan. Antony and Octavian give Herod the royal treatment and escort him to the Senate, where he is declared king of Judah and a Roman ally. He leaves the Senate with Antony on the right and Octavian on the left of him, or vice versa. Herod had the instatement and backing of the most powerful empire and the most powerful men in the world. Things just got real for Herod. So we're going to go back to the book for a sec. The Parthians in Jerusalem turned to looting, breaking into houses of those who had fled into the palace, sparing only Hyrcanus's money, which did not exceed 300 talents. So the Parthians have invaded Jerusalem and they're basically terrorizing the population, stealing anything that isn't bolted down and murdering a lot of people in the process. The total sum found fell short of the expectations, for Herod, long suspicious of Parthian trustworthiness, had already transferred the most valuable of his treasures to Idumea, an example followed by all his friends. The looting finished, the Parthian conduct became so outrageous that it filled the whole country with the war to the death, blotted out the city of Marissa, and after making Antigonus king, actually handed Thazel and Hyrcanus over to him in fetters to be tortured. When Hyrcanus fell down at his feet, Antigonus with his own teeth mutilated his ears, in order that he might never again resume the high priesthood in any circumstance, for a high priest must be physically perfect. Thazel, however, was too quick for him. He bravely dashed his head against a rock, as he was not free to use his own hand. Thus he showed himself a true brother of Herod and Hyrcanus, a cowardly poltroon. He died like a hero, crowning his own life's work with a fitting end. So the good thing about Josephus is he presents several accounts of history. He doesn't just go with one. He gives you one and then he gives another account that most likely did happen. It's a very thorough way of looking at history. Not a lot of historians do this. They usually stick to one version of history, which in most cases has been elaborated or fictionalized in certain parts. So it's good to see someone presenting both sides of the argument, much like this podcast. A rival version of the incident states that he revived after his first shock. And this is not me fucking this up, this is actually how it's written. It's a bit weird. But that a doctor sent by Antigonus to look after him filled the wound with noxious drugs and finished him off. Whichever version is correct, all honour to him for his attempt. It is said that before he breathed his last, he was told by some woman that Herod had escaped. Now he whispered, "I shall die happy, as I am leaving behind me a living man to avenge me." So he died. The Parthians had missed their main target. The woman but put Antigonus at the head of affairs in Jerusalem and carried off Hyrcanus in fetters to Parthia. Herod was driving on further towards Arabia, thinking his brother was still alive and anxious to get money from the king, as without it he could not hope to save Thazel by appealing to Parthian culpability. He reckoned that if the Arab was too forgetful for his friendship with Herod's father and too close-fisted to make him a gift, he could borrow the ransom from him by leaving in pledge the son of the man to be ransomed. He had his nephew with him, a boy of 7. He was further prepared to give him 300 talents, putting forward Tyrian intermediaries, but fate had forestalled his earnest efforts. Phazzle was dead, and Herod's brotherly affection was of no avail, nor did he find any friendship now among the Arabs. Their king, Malchus, sent him orders to leave the country forthwith, on the pretext that the Parthians had formally demanded the expulsion of Herod from Arabia. In actual fact, he had made up his mind to keep what he owed Antipater, and not to be shamed into repaying Antipater's generosity. By any kindness to his children in their distress, he was abetted in his shameless behaviour by men equally anxious to embezzle the money which Antipater had deposited with them, the most powerful of his courtiers. Meeting with the hostility of the Arabs for the very reason that had led him to expect their warmest friendship, Herod gave the messengers the answer suggested by his disappointment and turned back towards Egypt. The first night he bivouacked at one of the country's temples after picking up the men he had left behind. The next day he went on to Rhinocoria, where the story of his brother's death reached him. With anxiety for what might happen now, displaced by grief for what had happened already, he marched straight on. Belated, regretting his behaviour, the Arab king hastily sent messages to recall the man he had wronged, but Herod had already reached Pelusium, where he was refused a passage by the sailors in the harbour, and so appealed to their superiors. They, impressed by his rank and reputation, conducted him to Alexandria. When he entered the city, he received a splendid welcome from Cleopatra, who hoped to employ him as a commander in a projected campaign. But he evaded the queen's pressing request, and fearing neither a voyage in midwinter nor the turmoil in Italy, sailed for Rome. In serious danger of Pamphylia, he jettisoned the bulk of the cargo and with difficulty made Rhodes, which had suffered grievously in the war against Cassius. There he was received by his friends Ptolemy and Saphronius. Shortage of money did not prevent his having a very large trireme built. In this he sailed with his friends to Brundisium. From there he hurried on to Rome, where he first applied to Anthony as the friend of his father, telling him of his own and his family's misfortunes. Where he first appealed to Anthony as the friend of his father, telling him of his own and his family's misfortunes, and how he had to leave his nearest and dearest besieged in a fortress while he endured a winter crossing to appeal for assistance. So here's an example of that multi-generational relationship set up by his father. Herod and Mark Antony were very close friends. Herod's father had mentored Anthony and brought him up through the ranks when he was a young cavalry commander stationed in Egypt. So Anthony was well accustomed with the Herods and the family. Anthony was very grieved at the change in his fortunes, recalling Antipater's hospitality, and filled with admiration for the heroic character before him. He decided on the spot that the man he had once made tetrarch should now be king of the Jews. If regard for Herod moved him, dislike of Antigonus moved him just as much. He considered him an agitator and an enemy of Rome. Caesar, Herod found even more ready to help than Anthony. The Egyptian campaigns which Antipater had shared with his father were fresh in his mind, as were his hospitality and unshakable loyalty, and he could see Herod's appetite for action. He convened the Senate, of which Messala, supported by Artinius, introduced Herod, and gave a full account of his father's service and his own loyalty to Rome, at the same time making it clear that Antigonus was their enemy, not only because he had quarrelled with them before, but because he had now accepted the crown from the Parthians in defiance of the Romans. These revelations angered the Senate, and when Anthony rose to suggest that the Parthian war was an added reason for making Herod king, they all voted in favour. The house adjourned, and Anthony and Caesar went out with Herod between them, the councils of other magistrates leading the way in order to offer sacrifice, and to depose a decree in the capital. The first day of Herod's reign, Anthony celebrated with a banquet. That concludes Chapter 2, Herod's Rise to Power. Not too bad for a hybrid half the world away. His friendship with Anthony and Octavian had worked in his favour, and Herod and Antipater's gamble to back Rome was about to pay off with a vengeance. Herod gathers his army and leads the conquest to take back his kingdom once and for all. His first action is cornering a group of rebels in an impregnable cave system near Galilee. The rebels can't be attacked outright, but they can't escape either. So Herod has his forces lowered down into the cave system in boxes, where they snag rebels with hooks and throw them to their deaths in the caverns below. But this was small-scale warfare. Herod had to step up his game if he stood a chance at taking back Jerusalem and overthrowing Antigonus and the Parthian threat. They still needed to be dealt with. Herod has just one more obstacle standing in his way of total domination: Jerusalem. But Herod couldn't do it alone. He still needed Mark Antony's support to take the city. So whether this was a confidence issue or just a strategic one will never be known. It's probably a little of both. He did need probably more forces to take the city. He probably wasn't confident that he could probably do it himself. Although he had made some ground defeating the rebels at Galilee on his own, taking the city was too big and it needed to be approached as such. Anthony and Roman forces were winning and making significant grounds, pushing back the Parthian Empire. Mark Antony leads the siege on the fortress of Samosata. Herod was on his way to lend a hand and ask for assistance in taking back the city when the Parthians ambush Mark Antony and attack one of his supply trains. Herod counters the attack and beats back the Parthians, saving the day again. Antony was thrilled by Herod's actions and openly embraced him and welcomed him as an old friend, hugging Herod in front of his entire army. His relationship with Rome and Mark Antony was cemented forever. Antony sent assistance. He chased the Parthians out of the region and forces them back across the eastern side of the Euphrates. The next phase was a busy one. Mark Antony was more than thrilled by Herod and decided to give Herod the help he needed and gives him 30,000 infantry troops and 6,000 cavalry to take back the city in the name of Herod. The Romans are on the march. At the same time as this is happening, Herod marries Mariam. She was 17 at the time. He's a pretty busy man. You can fill in the blanks what might have been wrong with that one. Herod enlists the help of Roman general Gaius Sosus. He was a loyal supporter of Mark Antony who accompanied him on his campaigns in the east. It is unknown whether he was with Antony during some of his key battles like the siege of Samosata, however you pronounce it. Sosus was made proconsular governor of Syria and led attacks against Roman interests throughout the region, such as the Phoenician city of Abydos. So, he was a competent leader and knew his way around a battlefield. Antony orders Sosus to take out Antigonus and the Parthians and back Herod during the assault on the city, instating him as ruler. 2 legions move ahead of the main company to meet up with Herod before Sosus brings up the rest to begin the siege. Herod and Sosus together besiege the city. In a little nostalgic moment, Herod sets up his camp just north of the temple. So the temple that they're referring to is the Temple Mount that was rebuilt by Herod, which is basically all that's left of Solomon's temple today, pretty much just the outer walls of it. So there was a pass not too far away from the city that allowed access to the city walls. This was the same location that Pompey had chosen 26 years beforehand. Herod had a decent-sized force with him, around 30,000. In modern terms, it was more realistically around the 10 to 15,000 mark. Ancient sources always seem to exaggerate the numbers of troops they had. They always say it was 100,000, but in reality it was probably more like 50. It was logistically just too complicated to keep big armies like that in the field and to transport them. More people means more supplies, more food, more water, and so on. He also had 6,000 cavalry, Roman legions, and Syrian auxiliaries, all courtesy of Mark Antony. So Gaius Sosus leads the force and the siege begins. This was no joke. Herod goes balls out. Roman engineers build siege towers, a circumvallation wall, catapults and artillery. Antigonus and the people on the other side of the wall were in dire straits. Supplies were running out fast, and it also coincided with the sabbatical year. A sabbatical year is one where there is no harvest and nothing is planted. It's a year in which the land is left to recover, I'm pretty sure. So the Parthians put up a fight. and went on the counter-offensive. They ambushed the Romans, they countered undermining attempts and ramparts, but it was to no avail. The siege had been going for 40 days. Herod's forces breached the wall and entered the first level of the city. Another 15 days later, the second wall was breached, which leads to the breaching of the outer court walls of the temple. Antigonus, probably realizing that he had underestimated Herod and had royally fucked up, retreats to the citadel or the barrass north of the temple. He pretty much leaves the Parthians and the rest of the city defenders to hold off Herod's advances. A majority of the city had been taken except for the inner court and upper portions. The defenders begged Herod to let them bring their animals and offerings to the temple so that the religious rites could continue. Herod agreed to the request. This was wise. He showed some empathy for the people and their religious practices. Who knows, they might end up supporting him one day. This also helped spread Herod's image as a good guy and a tolerant leader. In times of crisis, he could have just killed them all, but he doesn't. So, however, things get out of hand very quickly. Herod's forces started killing and pillaging without mercy. Innocents as well as combatants were all massacred. Herod pleaded with them to stop the killing and restrain themselves, but the pleas fell on deaf ears. They were pretty much in a battle frenzy by this moment. They were just hacking down anybody in their way. There was no quarter being given. It was very brutal. Herod brings up the issue with HR and complains to Mark Antony, which didn't do much good. He tries to stop Roman soldiers from desecrating the inner sanctuary of the temple and the Holy of Holies. Not much works, so he bribes General Sosus and his men to stop the looting, claiming they don't leave a king of a desert, which is probably a good analogy. The pesky Antigonus surrenders to Sosus, who sends him back to Rome with Mark Antony to be the star attraction of the triumph procession. This causes a bit of an issue. Herod is concerned that Antigonus will eventually claw his way back to power and influence the powers that be in Rome, which would inevitably threaten Herod's reign. Herod bribes Mark Antony to kill Antigonus. Mark Antony agrees with Herod that Antigonus will be a continual threat, so he beheads him, marking the event as the first time the Romans executed a subjugated king. At the same time, 45 of Antigonus' supporters, mainly the Sanhedrin, were also executed, clearing the slate of opposition in Judah. Herod had won his kingdom, but there was one final hurdle to crush. As long as the Hasmonean line was still around, there was still a threat. This starts a chain reaction of executing the opposition and eliminating any and all threats to the crown. Hyrcanus II, the old sly dog, was the last of the Hasmoneans that really held any power or influence in Judah. He was executed by Herod in 30 BC. After this, you'd think it would be smooth sailing and all of Herod's problems were solved, his enemies were dead, and his kingdom was waiting for him to rebuild. The war was over, but a new one was on the horizon. Herod made a tactical decision to marry the granddaughter of Hyrcanus and the niece of Antigonus, Mariam, aka Mariam I. There's also a lot of Mariams that appear in the story. He marries her towards the end of the war. Was this personal? Did he like her? Did he fancy Mariam? Or was this completely a political decision? Considering he had just destroyed the last of the Hasmonean dynasty, was this a way of winning over the Hasmonean supporters? Hey, look, I'm marrying the last of the Hasmonean dynasty. I'm not all that bad. You can trust me. So was this a politically motivated marriage? The last of the Maccabean kings was dead, so maybe this was some symbolic or a way to show that he still cared about the old dynasties, or was it just a way to keep his enemies close? At the time of the marriage, Herod was already married to Doris. They had a son, Antipater. There's another Antipater. So how does he get around this problem? Well, he has both of them banished from the land. So the old wife is out of the picture and the new one is in. Obviously, he's done this for political reasons. He obviously can't have two wives, or maybe he can. It's at this time his mental state starts to become an issue. His paranoia and occasional psychotic outbursts in the years that follow will become his biggest obstacles. His physical threats to the kingdom were dead, but his mental ones were just beginning. Meanwhile, Mark Antony launches an invasion of Parthia with 100,000 troops, which ends in disaster. He loses a third of his force and is humiliated. He is saved by Cleopatra when she sends him supplies, but the damage to his credibility is done. He never really recovers his status after his failure. Herod, on the other hand, sets about pulling down the old world and starts to build a new. He has the old Barras fort north of the temple torn down. That's the one where Antigonus was hiding. Herod builds a massive new fortified tower with 4 turrets covering a giant square courtyard. This combines his obsession with security and his love of luxury. That would be a constant theme in his architecture to come. Thus begins the reign of Herod the Great. So to get a bit more information on what has just happened, we'll be having a look at Josephus. This is chapter 3, Herod, master of Palestine. All this time, Antigonus was besieging Masada, whose defenders had plenty of supplies of every other kind but were short of water. In view of this, Joseph, Herod's brother, with 200 of his men, planned to make a dash for Arabia, being informed of Malichus's desire to make amends to Herod. He would actually have left the fortress had it not happened that on the night of his departure rain fell in torrents, the reservoirs were filled to the brim, and he had no further wish to escape. They begin to make sorties against Antigonus's forces, and now engaging them in the open, now luring them into ambushes, destroyed large numbers. Of course they did not succeed every time, sometimes they were worsened and had to retreat. Meanwhile, Vendites, the Roman commander sent from Syria to check the Parthians, after dealing with them, had crossed into Judah, professedly to assist Joseph, but really to get money out of Antigonus. He encamped very close to Jerusalem, and after lining his pockets to his satisfaction, withdrew with most of his troops. But he left Silo in command of a detachment, for fear that removal of the whole army might make it only too evident what he had been after. Antigonus, meanwhile, in the hope of further help from the Parthians, courted Silo to avoid any interference with the fulfillment of this hope. But by the time Herod had sailed from Italy to Ptolemais, and having raised a substantial force of Jews and foreigners, was marching through Galilee against Antigonus, with the cooperation of Venditus and Solo, whom Delius, on Antony's behalf, had induced to insist Herod's return. But Venditus was busy settling sporadic disturbances resulting from the Parthian cooperation, and Silo remained in Judah, bribed with Antigonus's money. Not that Herod lacked support. As he moved on, his strength readily grew, and apart from a few localities, all Galilee took up his cause. The most urgent task facing him was Masada. He must first of all rescue his family and friends from the siege. Joppa stood in the way. It was in enemy hands and must be reduced first. Otherwise, while he went on to Jerusalem, his opponents would remain in possession of a stronghold behind his back. Tactical decision-making. Joined by Silo, who was only too pleased to have found a pretext for leaving Jerusalem, the Jews followed in pursuit, but Herod swooped on them with a handful of men, routing them easily and rescuing Silo, whose efforts at defence were feeble. He then took Joppa and hurried on to Masada and rescued his friends. Some of the country folk were drawn to him by their friendship with his father, so some of these good relationships come into play. Some by his own fame, some by the desire to repay the kindness of both, but the largest number by the prospect of a stable monarchy. Consistently, he had now got together an almost invincible army. Antigonus tried to check his progress by laying ambushes at suitable points on his route, very ineffectively as it turned out. Herod had no difficulty in freeing his friends in Masada and recovering the fortress of Thrisa. He then set out for Jerusalem, and he was joined by Silo's men and many Jews from the city, alarmed at his strength. So this is the first time we get a glimpse at the locals supporting Herod. They seem to like what he's doing. They see him as a strong leader, and they do favour a monarchy and a stable reign over the years of political infighting and leadership changes that have pretty much plagued this time period for decades at this point. Having pitched their camp west of town, Herod's men became the target of arrows and javelins of the guards on that side, while others made organised sorties to test the strength of his opponents. Herod at once had a proclamation made all around the walls that he came for the good of the people and the preservation of the city, and that he would take no action against his undisguised enemies, but would grant even his bitterest foes an amnesty. Antigonus' staff countered this appeal by forbidding anyone to listen to the proclamations, or to cross over. So Herod gave his men leave from then on to return the shots from the battlements, and they hurled their missiles to such effect that the towers were quickly cleared of defenders. So it's Herod the Merciful. He doesn't want a scorched earth policy. He obviously doesn't want to destroy his own city, well, his future city, and he doesn't want innocent people to die. He knows who the enemy is. He's not taking this out on innocent people. This is a far different Herod than the one we have seen previously. This is a very strong and competent leader. Also makes you wonder, is this due to Octavian and Mark Antony's blessing and his official instatement as King of Judah? So was it all just a psychological thing with Herod? Did he just need that boost to get him over the line? At this point, Silo's venerality became evident. He put up a number of his men to raise a clamour about short rations and demand money for food, and to insist on being marched to winter quarters in a suitable locality. There was nothing to be had anywhere near the city, as Antigonus' men had taken the lot. Silo thereupon began to strike camp in an attempt to withdraw, but Herod approached the Roman officers and then appealed to the rank and file not to leave him in the lurch, when he had come with the authority of Caesar, Antony, and the Senate. Mutiny on the horizon. That very day he would supply their wants. He had no sooner ended this appeal than he had set out in person for the countryside, returning with supplies in such abundance as gave the lie to all Silo's pretexts, and a guard against any possible shortage in the coming days. He requested the people living around Samaria, the city having espoused his course, to bring corn, wine, oil, and cattle to Jericho. Hearing of this, Antigonus sent orders around the country to block or ambush the food convoys. The people obeyed, and a large number of armed men gathered above Jericho, and stationed themselves on the hills to watch for the supply column. However, Herod was not idle. He set off with 10 cohorts, 5 Roman, 5 Jewish, with a sprinkling of mercenaries and a few of the cavalry, and arrived at Jericho, which he found deserted, but the high ground had been occupied by 500 men with their wives and families. These he captured but set free, while the Romans poured into the rest of the town and looted it, as they found the houses full of luxuries of every kind. Leaving a garrison in Jericho, the king returned and sent away the Roman contingent to winter in places that he had come over to him: Idumea, Galilee, and Samaria. Antigonus, for his part, but taking advantage of Silo's venerality, persuaded him to billet a portion of his army in Lydia to stop Antony. While the Romans enjoyed every comfort and a complete rest from fighting, Herod was not idle. He occupied Idumea with 400 horse and 2,000 foot, led by his brother Joseph, to forestall any movement in the support of Antigonus. His own task was to transfer his mother and all of his kinsmen and friends he had brought out of Masada to Samaria. When he had settled them safely there, he marched on to secure the remainder of Galilee and expel Antigonus's garrisons, forcing his way through a blizzard to Sepphoris. He occupied the city without opposition, the defenders fleeing at his approach. There he refreshed his followers, battered by the storm with the plentiful supplies available, setting out next against the bandits who lived in the caves, and overrun a great part of the country, causing the inhabitants as much misery as a war could have done. Sending on 3 infantry brigades and 1 troop of cavalry to the village of Arbela, he joined them 6 weeks later with the rest of his army. His coming failed to frighten the enemy, who sent out and armed to meet him with all the skill of warriors as well as the fearlessness of bandits, and joining battle routed Herod's left wing with their right. Promptly swinging around with his right wing, Herod came to the rescue, made his fleeing troops face about, and falling on the pursuers brought their advance to a halt, finally breaking their resistance by frontal attacks and putting them to flight. He pursued them to Jordan, attacking all the way and destroying a large portion of them, the survivors scattering beyond the river. Galilee could now breathe again. The only bandits left were lurking in caves. which is what we heard about earlier. At this point, Anthony was living near Athens, and Vanditus sent for Solo and Herod to take part in the Parthian War, instructing them first to settle the problem of Judah. Herod was delighted and seconded Silo and Vanditus, while he himself took the field against the bandits in the caves. He lowered the toughest of his soldiers in cradles till they reached the mouths of the caves. They then slaughtered the bandits with their families and threw firebrands at those who proved awkward. Wishing to save some of them, Herod invited them to come up to him. Not a man voluntarily surrendered, and for those who were brought out forcibly, many preferred death to captivity. One old man, father of 7 children, was begged by the children and their mother to let them come out as their lives were guaranteed. His response was terrible. One, he ordered them out of the cave, while he stood at the cave mouth and killed each son as he emerged. Herod, in a good position to watch, was cut to the heart and stretched out his hand to the old man, begging him to spare his children. But he, treating the suggestion with contempt, went so far as to sneer at Herod for the lack of guts, and after disposing of the last of the sons and killing his wife too, flung their bodies down the precipice and finally leapt over the edge himself. So, Herod is playing the good guy. Crushing all opposition with death is not his objective. It definitely does seem like he is trying to get as many people behind him as possible, and he is trying to save as many lives as he can. This is a perfect example of Herod being a brutal ruler, but also a compassionate one. Informed of the rising, Herod speedily came to the rescue, destroyed a large number of insurgents, reduced all their fortresses by siege, and as a penalty for their fickleness, made their towns pay a fine of 100 talents. By now the Parthians had been driven out of and Pacorius killed, so Vanditus was able, at Antony's suggestion, to send support to Herod. In his struggle with Antigonus, 2 legions and 1,000 horse, their commander, Macarius, received a letter from Antigonus begging him to come to his aid instead, complaining bitterly of Herod's unscrupulous use of force against his kingdom, and promising to make it worth his while. Macarius, however, was not prepared to disobey higher authority, especially as Herod was offering more, so he refused to turn traitor, and simulating friendship went to spy out Antigonus' position, disregarding Herod's warnings. Antigonus was not deceived, but shut the city gates in the face and shot at him from the ramparts as an enemy, until the crestfallen general returned to Herod at Emmaus, so furious at his failure that he killed every Jew he met on the way, not sparing even Herod's men, but treating everyone as a supporter of Antigonus. This made Herod so angry that he was on the point of attacking Maccaeus as an enemy, but mustering his rage, he set out for Antony's headquarters to expose the outrageous conduct of his subordinate. Maccaeus, realizing his mistake, followed on the king's heels, and by eating humble pie, mollified him. But Herod continued his journey all the same, and when he heard that Antony was conducting a large-scale attack on Samosta, a well-fortified city near the Euphrates, he increased his speed. Seeing an excellent chance of showing his mettle and placing Antony under an obligation, and so it proved. As soon as he arrived, he finished the siege for them, killing masses of the enemy and capturing quantities of booty, so that Antony's old admiration for his prowess was greatly strengthened, and he heaped new honours upon him, confirming his hopes of mounting the throne, while King Antiochus was forced to surrender Samosta. Meanwhile, a heavy blow befell Herod's fortunes in Judah. He had left his brother Joseph in complete charge, instructing him to make no move against Antigonus till his return. Since the unreliability of Macarius as an ally was evident from what he had done, but as soon as Joseph heard that his brother was a long way off, he disregarded his instructions and marched towards Jericho with 5 cohorts contributed by Macarius. He went with the intention of seizing the corn crop at the height of summer. In hilly, difficult terrain, he was set upon by his adversaries. He himself was killed after playing a hero's part in the battle, and the Romans perished to a man. The cohorts were new levies from Syria, with no stiffening of veterans to strengthen the morale of raw recruits. Not satisfied with his victory, Antigonus went to such an extreme of fury that he even mutilated Joseph's corpse. Having got possession of the bodies of the dead, he cut off his head, although his brother Pharos offered to redeem it for 50 talents. Antigonus's victory was followed by such an upheaval in Galilee that his partisans dragged the more important of Herod's adherents to the lake and drowned them. Many parts of Idumea too changed sides, though Machias was there, rebuilding a stronghold called Geta. Not a word of all this had yet come to Herod's ears. After the fall of Samosata, Antony had made Sosus governor of Syria, instructing him to assist Herod against Antigonus. While himself returned to Egypt, Sosus accordingly sent 2 legions ahead to reinforce Herod in Syria, following on the heels with the rest of the army. But while Herod was at Daphne near Antioch, vivid dreams informed him of his brother's death, and as he sprang in alarm from his bed, messengers came in with the news of the disaster. So a bit of divine prophecy. For a brief while he gave vent to his distress, then postponing further mourning, hurried off at the killing pace in the direction of his enemies. Arriving at Lebanon, he was reinforced by 800 of the hillmen and joined by 1 Roman legion. Without waiting for daylight, he led his mixed forces into Galilee, where he was met by the enemy but drove them back to their base and began a continuous assault on its fortifications. So I guess his mixed origins are paying off. He is supported by various groups in the area. And this obviously would have showed the Romans that they had backed the right horse. They had definitely made the right choice in leadership. And their plan for Judah was starting to pay off. Before he could take it, a phenomenal storm compelled him to seek shelter in the village nearby. Within a few days later, the 2nd Legion sent by Antony joined forces with him. He increased strength, alarmed the enemy, and in the night they abandoned the stronghold. Herod next passed through Jericho, determined to take the speediest vengeance on his brother's killers. There, thanks to Providence, he had an astonishing and miraculous escape. He gained him the reputation of being the darling of heaven. Many of the local magistrates had dined with him that evening, and when the banquet was over and everyone had left, the building immediately caved in. Weird. Deeming this a joint portent of dangers and deliverance in the coming campaign, at dawn he moved forward with his army. About 6,000 of the enemy charged down from the hills and engaged his advance guard. They did not feel inclined to meet the Romans hand to hand, but pelted them at long range with stones and javelins, wounding a large number, including Herod himself, who as he rode along was struck by a javelin in the side. He was joined by a steady stream of Jews from Jericho and other places. Some though hated Antigonus, others impressed by Herod's success, but most in the grip of an uncontrollable longing for change. The harbour of all change is change itself. Herod was impatient for a fight, and Pappus, completely confident in the face of superior numbers and Herod's extraordinary energy, advanced against him, eager for a fray. When the clash came, most of the enemy lines stood firm for a time, but Herod, remembering his murdered brother and risking everything to get his revenge on the murderers, quickly mustered the troops facing him and then attacked in turn all the groups that still held out, till in the end the whole army was in flight. The carnage was frightful, with the enemy driven back into the village from which they had set out, and Herod mercilessly assaulting their rear and killing more than could be counted. Along with the enemy he rushed into the village, where every house was packed with armed men to the roofs, and the roofs crowded with defenders who threw missiles down at him. First defeating them outside, he tore the houses to pieces and dragged out those within. On a great many he pulled down the roofs, destroying them en masse. Those who crawled out of the ruins were met by soldiers sword in hand. So vast were the piles of corpses that the streets were blocked to the victors. Such a blow the enemy could not survive. Those who reassembled after the battle, seeing the destruction of their village, fled in all directions. Emboldened by his victory, Herod would at once have driven on to Jerusalem, if he had not been held up by a most violent storm. This circumstance robbed him of his crowning success in the final defeat of Antigonus, who was already planning to abandon the city. That's another reoccurring part of Herod's story, is he gets held up by storms a lot. He's been held up by a blizzard, there's been a torrential downpour, and now a violent storm. Is this God intervening? It does seem very curious that that continues to pop up. Like a lot of ancient battles, and especially with Herod, you can never just go straight to the end goal. You had to basically cut your way through the entire region just to, in Herod's case, just to reach Jerusalem. He has to go through pretty much every town and every village and every fort just to get to his main goal of Jerusalem. He can't just attack it outright, otherwise he'd be surrounded on all sides by the enemy. He's taken a tactical path to victory. In the evening, Herod dismissed his weary comrades to refresh themselves, while he himself, still hot from the fight, went to take a bath like any other soldier, attended by a single slave. He was on the point of entering the bathhouse when one of the enemy dashed out in front of him, sword in hand. Then a second and a third. The others in their train. These men had fled from the battlefield into the bathhouse fully armed. There they had cowered unnoticed for a time, but when they saw the king, they lost their nerve entirely and run past him, unarmed as he was, shaking with fear, and dashed for the exits. As it happened, no one else was there to seize the men, and Herod was content to have come to no harm. So they all got away. Next day he cut off the head of Pappus, Antigonus's general, who had perished in the fighting, and sent it to his brother Phereus as reparation for the murdered brother, for it was Pappus who had killed Joseph. An eye for an eye. Herod is very lucky he wasn't just cut to pieces at the bathhouse. Why wouldn't they? Or maybe they were feared if they did kill the king, their own lives would be forfeit. They'd probably be killed not too long after. Who knows what they were thinking, but he is very lucky. In this entire story, he's been pretty lucky the entire way through. He's been hit in the side with a projectile. He wasn't killed. He's been, knocked around in battle. He's obviously not afraid to go take the front lines by himself. When the storm died down, Herod drove on towards Jerusalem and brought his army up to the walls. It was now the 3rd year since he had been proclaimed king of Rome. Wow, I didn't know that. I thought this was all over a year or two. It's a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. When you're reading stuff, and researching, it obviously sounds a lot more compressed than it is. You don't realise the amount of time that actually passes between battle to battle. Obviously they're not fighting every week, there'd be months off in between. He pitched his camp opposite the temple, as from the direction an attack could be launched, and it was there that Pompey had captured the city. Dividing the task among the troops, he stripped the suburbs of trees and ordered 3 artificial platforms to be raised and towers erected on them. Then, leaving his most competent subordinates to supervise the work, he went to Samaria to fetch Alexander's daughter, this is Mariam, whom he had promised to marry. As mentioned before, he made his wedding incidental to the siege. He no longer took the enemy seriously. The wedding was over. Back he went to Jerusalem with still stronger forces. Sosus tried to join him at the head of the very large army of horse and foot, which he had sent on by inland route, while he himself marched through Phoenicia. The combined forces tallied 11 infantry brigades and 6,000 cavalry, not counting the Syrian auxiliaries who added considerably to their strength. They encamped together near the north wall, Herod relying on the senatorial decrees appointing him king, Sosus and Antony's decision to send the army under his command to support Herod. Despite the overwhelming strength of the besieging army, they maintained their resistance for more than 4 months. The Jewish masses throughout the city showed their agitation in various ways. Crowding around the sanctuary with feebler creatures, behaved as if possessed. The fiending inspiration poured out a mass of prophecies to fit the situation. The boldest spirits went on in gangs to carry out raids of every kind. and especially to seize all supplies within the reach of the city, leaving no food for man or beast. Of the fighting men, the more disciplined were organised to resist the besiegers from the ramparts. They hindered the raising of the platforms and countered the engines with a succession of new devices. In nothing did the soar so much over the enemy as in the mining operations. The king parried the raids by devising ambushes which put a stop to their excursions. He overcame the food shortages by fetching supplies from the distance, and he got the better of the fighting men by using Roman tactical skill. Though they showed amazing audacity in broad daylight, they would hurl themselves against the Roman lines to certain death, and though their mine shafts they would suddenly appear in the middle of Herod's men, and before any section of the wall was battered down, they would build another one in its stead. In short, with neither hand nor brain did they show the slightest weariness, determined as they were to hold out to the last. Indeed, despite the overwhelming strength of the besieging army, they maintained their resistance for more than 4 months. Yeah, siege warfare isn't nice, and it goes on for a very long time. All those movies you see that depict sieges, it always makes it look like it's 2 days or a long weekend, but in reality it's months to years. Finally, some of Herod's stormtroopers ventured to scale the wall and leap into the city, followed by Sosus's centurions. First to be captured was the area around the temple. Then the army poured in, and there was frightful carnage everywhere. As the Romans were furious at the length of the siege, and Herod's Jewish soldiers determined that no one opponent should survive, they were massacred by the thousands, crowded together in the streets and houses, or fleeing to the sanctuary. No mercy was shown to infants or the aged, or to defenceless women. Although the king sent round imploring them to discriminate, no one stayed his hand. But as if raging mad, they venerated their fury over every age alike. At this point, Antigonus, paying no regard to the past or to his present position, came down from his palace and fell at Sosus's feet. The Roman, not in the least moved by his changed situation, laughed and called him Antigon. But he did not treat him like a woman and let him go free. He put him in fetters and kept him in custody. Herod's first problem after mustering his enemies was to master also his foreign allies, for the alien masses were determined to see the temple and the sacred things inside the sanctuary. The king appealed to some, threatened others, and drove yet others back by force of arms, thinking victory more terrible than defeat if such people got a glimpse within the veil. At the same time, he stopped all looting in the city, telling Sosus with the utmost emphasis that if the Romans stripped the city of money and men, they would leave him king of a desert. Interesting and turbulent stuff going on. So skip ahead. King Herod did not make the mistake of treating all citizens alike. By bestowing honours on those who had taken his side, he increased their devotion. The supporters of Antigonus he liquidated. As money was now tight, he turned all his personal treasures into cash and sent it to Antony and his staff. Even so, he could not buy freedom from all trouble. Antony, ruined by his passion for Cleopatra, had become the complete slave of his desire, while Cleopatra had gone right through her own family till not a single relation was left alive. Okay, it's not just Herod who kills his own family. It seems to be a very common thing in these times. Just wipe out your entire family so you can take power for yourself. It's also interesting to see how some people are following Herod and others aren't. It also shows the predicament and tough situation that he was really in. He couldn't please everybody, but he generally does seem like he is trying to save as many people as possible. Even though it's not really a reality in the end. Some people are going to hate him, some people are going to love him, but he does try his best. And thirsting now for the blood of strangers, while slandering the authorities in Syria and urging Antony to have them executed, thinking that in this way she should easily become mistress of all their possessions. She even extended her acquisitiveness to Jews and Arabs and worked in secret to get their kings, Herod and Malchus, put to death. Interesting things happening behind the scenes here. When the war that ended at Actium broke out, Herod prepared to take the field with Anthony, having settled all disturbances in Judah and captured Hyrcania, a fortress till then in the hands of Antigonus' sister, but he was prevented by Cleopatra's cunning from sharing Antony's dangers. As mentioned already, she was scheming against the kings, and now she persuaded Antony to entrust Herod with the war against the Arabs. If he won, she would become mistress of Arabia. If he lost of Judah, and she would be using one ruler to get rid of another. It was Herod, however, who benefited by her scheme. He began by plundering enemy country. Then he got together a large force of cavalry and sent them into battle near the city of Dium, emerging victorious despite determined resistance. The defeat led to feverish activity among the Arabs, who gathered at Canthia in Coele in enormous strength and awaited the Jews. There Herod arrived with his army, and endeavouring to conduct his campaign with great circumspection, ordered a camp to be fortified. His soldiers, however, disregarded his commands, and elated by their earlier success, attacked the Arabs, routed them at the first charge, and followed in pursuit. But in the pursuit, Herod was the victim of treachery, the inhabitants of Canthia being sent against him by Athenio, one of Cleopatra's generals, was permanently hostile. The onslaught resorted the morale of the Arabs, who turned about and joining forces on rocky, difficult ground, routed Herod's men, slaughtering them wholesale. Those who escaped the battle sought shelter in Orzium, but their camp was surrounded and captured with all the defenders by the Arabs. Soon after the disaster, Herod brought up reinforcements, but it was too late. Responsibility for the tragedy rested with his undisciplined subordinates. Yes, it's a big issue. Discipline in the field. Ownership and responsibility always falls upon the leader. If the battle had not been joined prematurely, Atheno would have found no opportunity for treachery. Still, Herod got even with the Arabs later by repeatedly overrunning their country, so that they often had reason to remember ruefully their one victory. But while he was settling accounts with the enemy, other disasters befell him. An act of God occurring in the 7th year of his reign, at the height of the Actian War, and at the beginning of spring, there was an earthquake that destroyed 30,000 people and innumerable cattle. The army escaped unhurt. As it was camping in the open, at once Arab confidence was stimulated by rumour, which always makes disasters seem worse than they are. Convinced that Judah was the one vast ruin, the land deserted at their mercy, they descended on it, first offering a sacrificial victim, that envoys who had just arrived from Judah. The invasion completely demoralized the people. The spirit was broken by the succession of overwhelming disasters. So Herod brought them together and tried by the following appeal to awaken the spirit of resistance. It was surely quite uneasy to take flight like this. To be upset by an act of God was natural enough. To be equally upset when men attack you shows a very poor spirit. I for one am so far from being alarmed because the enemy have come after the earthquake that I believe God sent it to trap the Arabs and make them pay us the penalty for what they have done. It was not so much their own strength and skill as our accidental misfortunes that gave them confidence to come here. So skipping ahead. By his speech, Herod put a new spirit into his soldiers, and satisfied with their enthusiasm, he sacrificed to God, immediately after crossing the Jordan with his army, pitching his camp near Philadelphia, quite close to the enemy. He began skirmishing with them for the possession of the fort in no man's land. Being anxious of an early trial of strength, it happened that the enemy had sent a party forward to seize this strong point. The king's men quickly drove them back and occupied the hill. Herod himself daily led out his forces, deployed them for battle, and challenged the Arabs. Not a man came forward to oppose him. They were in a state of utter panic, and even more than the rank and file of General Althemus, who incapacitated by terror. So Herod advanced to their palisade and began to tear it down. At that they had to do something, and they came out to battle in disorder, infantry mixed with cavalry. In numbers they had the advantage of the Jews, but in enthusiasm they could not be compared. Through desperation made even them show reckless courage. So as long as they stood their ground, their losses were few, but when they turned tail, many were killed by the Jews and many trampled to death by their friends. 5,000 fell, the remainder lost no time in crowding within the palisade. Surrounding and besieged by Herod, they should have fallen to an assault in the failure of the water supply had not forced them to send envoys at once. The king treated them with contempt, and the offer of 500 talents only made him intensify his attacks. Parched with thirst, the defenders came out en masse and voluntarily gave themselves up, so that in 5 days 4,000 were taken prisoner. The next day, in desperation, the remainder came out to give battle. Herod encouraged them and killed about 7,000 more. By this overwhelming blow, he settled his account with Arabia and humbled the pride of her people so triumphantly that the nation chose him as their protector. So he's making a name for himself, and he's solidifying his rule everywhere. So a lot more stuff happens between Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Herod is expanding his empire. After addressing these gracious words to the king and setting the crown on his head, he published a decree announcing the award and expressing with the utmost generosity his high opinion of the beneficiary. After placating him with presents, Herod interceded on behalf of Alexius, a friend of Antony who had asked for mercy. But the thought naturally occurred to Caesar and his men that in the view of his generosity, Herod's kingdom was far too small. So when Caesar arrived in Egypt and Cleopatra and Antony were now dead, he showed honours upon him, restored to his kingdom the area sliced off by Cleopatra, and added Gardia, Hippias, and Samara, with the coastal towns Gaza, Athedon, Joppa, and Stratos Tower. He further made him a present of 400 Gauls, to be his bodyguards as they had formerly been Cleopatra's. Of all his liability, there was no more potent cause than the open-handedness of the recipient. In the 15th year of his reign, he restored the existing sanctuary and round it enclosed an area double the former size, keeping no account of the cost and achieving the magnificence beyond compare. This could be seen particularly in the great colonnades that ran around the entire temple, and the fortress that towered over it to the north. The former were completely new structures, the later an extremely costly reconstruction. As luxurious as a palace and named Antonia in honour of Antony, his palace, built in the upper city, consisted of 2 very large, very lovely buildings, which made even the sanctuary seem insignificant. These he named after his friends, one Caesareum, one Agrippium. But it was not in the buildings only that he enshrined the memory in their names. Through his lavish generosity, whole cities came into being. In the district of the Samaritas, he built a city with magnificent walls over 2 miles long, settled in it 6,000 colonists, allotted them some land for excellent quality, and in the centre of the new town erected a vast shrine, with precipice 300 yards in length dedicated to Caesar. The town he called Sebasta, and to the citizens he granted a very special charter. At a later date, when Caesar had enriched him by the addition of further lands, there also he erected a shrine of white marble dedicated to his patron, near the sources of Jordan, at a place called Panium. There is a mountain here whose top is lost in the clouds, in the lower slopes in a cavern, with its mouth concealed by vegetation, inside which a sheer precipice descended, nobody knows how far, to a cavity filled with still water. No plummet has ever reached the bottom. However long the cord from the roots of the cavern outside, well up the springs, with some consider to be the headwaters of Jordan. A true account will be given later. At Jericho, between the fortress of Cyprus and the old palace, he built other new buildings, better and more comfortable for visitors, named after some friends. In fact, I cannot think of any suitable spot in this kingdom that he left without some tribute of esteem for Caesar. When he had failed his own country with temples, these tributes overflowed into the province, and in the city he erected a Caesareum. So we have a final word from Josephus about Herod. Herod's bodily strength was as great as his power of mind. He had always excelled in hunting, owing his success mainly to his horsemanship. On a single day he once brought down 40 beasts. The country breeds boars, and stags and wild asses are still commoner. He was also an incomparable fighter. On the training ground, many were amazed to see his accuracy in throwing the javelin, and the regularity with which his arrows found their target. Besides his bodily and mental advantages, he enjoyed the best of luck. He met with very few military defeats, and for these he was not to blame. They were due either to his soldiers' rashness or someone's treachery. And I think that's where we'll end it. We'll pick up the story of Herod in part 2. But until then, that is the end of the show. Thank you all very much for listening. If you made it to the end, a big thank you. I know it was pretty long. That was the first ever Truth Tank Christmas special. So, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you for the support in 2020. Thank you to everybody who listened. And here's to 2021. I hope to see you all back here next year. I hope to grow the show, get a couple more shows out. Thank you for your support, and I hope to see you back here for more of the Truth Tank. If you'd like to support the show, there's a few things you can do. Hit the subscribe button on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Join the Facebook group. Big things are coming in the future, so the Facebook page is the best place to find out about what's happening with the Truth Tank. Spread the word. Tell friends, tell family, tell strangers on the street or people on the bus. Get the word out there. As always, thank you for listening. I am the Tank. This is the Truth. May the truth be with you.